Well, good morning to everyone here in Ottawa, and good afternoon and evening to all of those joining us online from other parts of the world. My name is Khalil Shariff. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Foundation Canada, and it is a very special delight to welcome you all to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate for today's program. We are gathering here in Ottawa at the site where the indigenous trustees of this land for millennia, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, said it was the place where the three rivers meet, just here, not far from this building. And for generations, the indigenous people of this area, every season, welcomed their indigenous colleagues from a very large catchment area to come here and gather in the spirit of exchange, in the exchange of goods and services for sure, but also an exchange of relationships and of ideas. And it is a very special privilege and maybe even a special responsibility for us to be remembering that extraordinary tradition of the indigenous people of this land and to be contributing somehow to carrying on and learning from that tradition in this space. Because today we are here to gather in a spirit of exchange, of ideas, and of relationships. Every event we do here is special. Today, I would say, has a very particular delight about it because it is a partnership, the first, in fact, we've done with the Brookings Institution, who have established a Center for Sustainable Development and have, in their wisdom, identified a Canadian as its head, John MacArthur, who you will be able to applaud riotously in just moments from now. The occasion for our gathering is the publication of a compendium of essays by the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings called the SDG Second Half, Ideas for Doing Things Differently. Many of you will know that as part of the UN General Assembly gatherings last month, the leaders of the world deliberated on where we have come from in the time since the SDGs were promulgated and how much work there is yet to be done. So we will be taking that up as well in our gathering today to look at what is the role of the Sustainable Development Goals in a rapidly changing global environment. Not only for Canada's role in the world, but even what the SDGs mean for Canada here at home. And we've got a very exciting program for you. We'll take up in the first half the question of the SDGs and its relevance to Canada's global development posture. And then in a second conversation, look at the way in which the SDGs are playing with respect to our development goals domestically in Canada. And those will be twin conversations today with a really extraordinary group of panelists. To kick us off this morning, I'm delighted to be inviting two people on stage. We're particularly honored to have with us today Chris MacLennan, who is Canada's Deputy Minister for International Development. Many of you will know Chris. Chris brings with him a very long history of distinguished contributions as a public servant in Canada. Many of those years actually devoted to global development. In addition to his current responsibilities as Deputy Minister, he's also the Sherpa for the G20 process, and so this is bringing him into the very center of a series of global cross currents which are, in a sense, destabilizing in all kinds of ways. And so we're really delighted that Chris has agreed to join us this morning and to be part of this discussion. After Chris, we're going to ask John MacArthur to provide an overview of the key issues that the SDG Second Half report is trying to address. John is a Canadian, now the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings. John brings with him that extraordinary effort at being a triathlete. He brings the rigor of an extraordinary academic career as a political economist and development economist, the imagination and creativity as a policy entrepreneur, and the savvy and ingenuity of a practitioner in a number of development contexts. And so we're really delighted to have John bring all those gifts, not only to his work at Brookings, but also to our discussion today. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris MacLennan to the stage. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Khalil, and thank you to the Brookings Institution and to the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm not going to speak very long because after that introduction of John, I'm pretty excited to hear John speak. I don't know about anybody else, but a triathlete in development, it's hard to top that. I am Canadian. I don't know if that gets me anything, but I'm looking forward to John. So I thought a little bit about what I would say in coming up here to provide some opening remarks, some opening thoughts from the perspective of Global Affairs Canada and the Government of Canada. And it struck me that if there's a perspective that I bring, it's probably that of the policy maker, which is across many domains seen as somehow as if you have this ultimate power to wield all of the state tools and state power. You don't, but you do get to influence it. And so from a policymaker's perspective, I think we're at a very interesting point. This is actually a point for policymakers that is particularly important because we are now in the medium term. Medium-term planning is a thing in government. And that horizon is about a 5 to 7 year horizon when you can actually think through the building and the implementation of actual initiatives to get you to whatever the objectives are, public policy objectives you're seeking to achieve. And so, of course, we are at that point with the SDGs. For governments, this is the point at which the planning and whether it's projects, policies, programs, are actually on the horizon is 2030 for many of those. And so I think the gathering that's taking place here today that brings together both a global perspective, so what are the development agencies of the world thinking about, what are development practitioners thinking about on that medium term, but also countries. Now the country at issue today is Canada and Canada's approach to implementing the SDGs, but we can also think about this from the perspective of developing countries. What are they thinking about in terms of their medium-term planning and their efforts to achieve the SDGs? So the starting point of that type of a conversation, I think, is where are you now? And, I won't go into the long tail, but it's pretty sobering, kind of where we are right now, and that was the sobering discussion that Khalil referred to at the SDG Summit, which just took place at the UN High-Level Week in September. So there's been some progress. I mean, I think that is the first thing that should be acknowledged. There is some elements of pretty important progress. So under 5 mortality, which has been a key priority of the Government of Canada in its development programming, has, there's been some significant progress with 133 countries actually meeting the SDG goal, and another 10 or 20 hoping to meet it by 2030. Access to electricity, which is actually a very important element, core to development writ large, is on track, and access to the internet. But unfortunately, the majority of the story is one of off-track. Off-track, 130 of all of the indicators that can be, 140 that can be measured are actually off-track. 30% have regressed from 2015, and in a very sobering situation, since 2019, there's an additional 122 million people who are suffering from chronic hunger, which is one of the core SDGs. So here we are at the midpoint, and the story is very much one of, we've got not just a lot of work to do to get to 2030, we actually have to make up ground that we've lost. Now, why have we lost ground? I would say there's probably 3 core things that have led to us losing ground. The first one is, and there's lots of discussion about this, the first one obviously is the cascading crises that have worked together in ways that were completely unpredictable. So, the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the return of interstate war, particularly the war in Ukraine. None of these events were individually predictable. It was predictable that a pandemic might happen at one point. How it would play out was obviously nobody knew. But these 3 crises, and there are others, have worked together in ways that has absolutely had detrimental impacts on developing countries and their ability to actually put forward a development program and to see through on their development path. The second big one has been the financing challenge. Now, the financing challenge is not an unknown. This was a known in 2015. So as remarkable as it was that in 2015 the world, I think, was able to come together in a universalist spirit to come together with a cohesive set of 17 goals, it was always known that the financing gap was going to be the toughest part. The Addis Ababa Action Plan was an element of that, about how do we draw in more and more private sector capital, in addition to finding ways how can we better use official development assistance. So this was a known problem, but it has only gotten worse. Why has it gotten worse? It's gotten worse because the global economic situation has worsened. The climate change challenges have created additional pressures on development assistance and additional pressures on national governments that have to be done in addition to your poverty reduction efforts. And so the scope of what is needed has increased from where we were in 2015. And the final thing that I would note, and I think this is the one that remains very unpredictable. The other ones are predictable in their impact, that they will impact. The thing that I think is very unpredictable is the state of international cooperation. As the Prime Minister's personal representative for the G20, I used to say I had a front row seat, and then someone told me, actually, you're up on stage. It truly is, the G20 is a bit of a microcosm of the discussions and the debates and how they have shifted fundamentally from 2015. I do not have a huge amount of confidence that if we had to arrive at an agreement among 193 countries on the SDGs today, that we could ever actually get there in the way that we were able to in 2015. That is very important to keep in mind when thinking about these things. But the international environment, geopolitics, have become a much more unpredictable state to work within, and what that means for the efforts over the next 7 years, I think we are going to have to figure out as a community in development practice, how do we factor that into the efforts that we're undertaking? And I would hope that that's one of the things that we might want to kind of suss out over the course of the panels today, and I'm looking forward to that. So that leaves me maybe with my last thought, which is on the Brookings Institution. And so somebody asked me, do you get invited to do a lot of these things? And I said, yes, I do, and I don't accept many of them. But I did accept this one. And one of the core reasons I accepted this one is that this is exactly the type of things and issues that we should be discussing, which are tangible, real ideas that can have a fundamental impact on advancing elements of the SDGs, or more largely, elements of a development practice. I would argue that the SDGs, and part of the challenge with the SDGs, is that they are a shared map for development, but they're not the vehicle. The SDGs are not the vehicle that are going to get you there. Now, the vehicle, I think, is a discussion that's very much worth having. Like, what does national development look like as we move into the next third of the 21st century? What are the things that are required? I don't know what that looks like writ large. There have been many theories of what is effective development. I do know that it starts with the type of conversation that the Brookings Institution papers put on the table. And it is about sussing out core elements of development to figure out how do these things work in the future, and where and how can they help us keep on track on that map towards the SDGs. So I fully expect that we'll be meeting on a regular basis to talk about the SDGs, their relevance, their importance, how we can use them as a development practitioner community, how they will play out at the big tables, for example, at places like the G20, at the United Nations, at the World Bank. And I think the more that we can focus on the types of concrete issues that the Brookings Institution has put on the table, I think the better we'll be going forward. And so with that, I thank you very much. Je vous remercie. Oh, and I'm supposed to welcome to the stage the triathlete of international development, Mr. John MacArthur.
I recently had a broken foot, and so that's about how I feel when described as a triathlete of any form these days. But huge thanks, Chris. Huge thanks, Khalil. Huge thanks to Nuju and Sophia, the entire team here at the foundation. It's an honor. I'm John MacArthur, as was mentioned, Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development. This is our first type of venture like this. We were established almost 3 years ago to the day at Brookings, and I want to recognize our colleagues who are central in that effort, including Homi, Kharas and Tony Pippa, as we launched this center, and we're honored that Caren joined us just last year. But we launched this center because we recognized, and we were thrilled that Brookings recognized, these issues of sustainable development are of a new type. The only thing I would quibble with of the discussion today so far is how much we talk about development and how much we talk about sustainable development. Why does that matter? In my view, it's ultimately because for too long, development has been framed as an over there question. Sustainable development is an everywhere question. It is a here question, it is a there question, it is an all of our places question. We launched this center, and for me personally it was very important because it was not just us taking on these issues of everywhere, but I think Brookings sending its own signal that these issues aren't going anywhere. So for the Center for Sustainable Development to have the privilege to join with AKFC is an honor. It's the first time we've ever done anything with a major partner in another country like this. It's probably not an accident that it's Canada, given some of the personal connections. But it's an extra special thrill for a bit of personal history. I first heard of Khalil Shariff when we were contemporaries at the University of British Columbia in the 1990s. And Khalil was famous. You should meet this guy. But you could never find him because he was either top of his class or on the school board out in Richmond as the youngest ever elected official to the Richmond School Board when he was 18. And he was this dynamic force for change. And it was actually a professor, I think Mark Zacher is smiling somewhere today, the late Mark Zacher, who was one of Canada's leading scholars of international relations for many, many years, who said, you guys should meet sometime. And it was after we graduated that we became friends. But Khalil, I was reflecting, it took us about 25 years to do things differently, to actually organize something together today. So we finally got our own memo. But I also want to thank everyone for recognizing what we thought was an interesting exercise around doing things differently. We had a lot of quick conversations internally. What could we do as a group of scholars to inform practical conversations on how to do things differently? And we picked that phrase, doing things differently, for the SDG Second Half. And I want to recognize Jacob Taylor, who co-edited this volume. We had people like Sarah Mendelson, Amar Bhattacharya, Matthew Bishop, Rebecca Winthrop, Nahid Sarabi, Priya Vora, George Ingram, Jane Nelson. Everyone contributed their perspective on a cross-section of issues, in addition to the people you're going to hear from today. Daniel Bicknell, Alexandra Bracken all helped us get to this point. But today, doing things differently, I think, takes on a new resonance for all of us. We are in a moment where we have been asked to reflect at the SDG midpoint a couple of weeks ago on how's it going at the midpoint from 2015 to 2030. I've been reflecting leading up to today on how much and how little has changed and how much and how little has been done differently since 2015. You will hear today from some people who I consider founders from our side. Homi Kharas is in many ways the founder of the Global Leave No One Behind agenda as the person who authored the high-level panel report on post-2015. He's also the founder of the concept of a new global middle class, which was not a concept we'd thought about before. Book coming out soon, by the way. Tony is one of the founders, Tony Pippa, of the Sustainable Development Goals. He and 192 of his best friends joined at the United Nations to give us that agreement, which probably wouldn't be forged today. Not all of them might have been his best friends, but they made it to be friendly enough to agree. He's also the founder of the SDG Leadership Cities Network, which realized very quickly this has to move beyond countries and get to where people live and the localities in which they operate. Caren Groen is, of course, a founder of the feminist economics movement and has spent decades helping not just feminist economists, but also what one might call orthodox economists understand how to think differently about the challenges that half of the world faces, but also that both halves of the world need to confront. Even dividing in halves is not right, of course, in a world of much more complex gender identities. And we have Margaret Biggs here, who is in many ways the founder, as the last president of CEDA, of the integrated approach to foreign policy in the Canadian government side, and has been a founder of so many new approaches to integrating the practical implications of sustainable development, not just in our international policy, but what that means for Canada too. So there's a lot of founding spirit here today, just amongst the colleagues that I happen to know best. I think that founding spirit is what we need to carry through. This is not a moment, in my view, for business as usual. It is not a moment for excess nostalgia. It is a moment for building. A moment for building new approaches, new concepts, and new things to do differently. The actual founding document that gave us the Sustainable Development Goals is called Transforming Our World. I find the word transforming a bit tricky because it's so big. I like the word change. What needs to change? Well, Chris already gave us a very important set of reflections on things that have changed just since 2015. The message you just gave, Chris, is quite different than the one most people heard at the UN a couple weeks ago, where most people walked away from the UN thinking things are worse. It's not going very well. Well, since 2015, 1 million more kids every year are making it to their 5th birthday. That's a change for the better. We've actually had one of the biggest areas of change is ocean protection around the world. Goal 14, the goal everyone forgets about, is one of the goals that's had the most dramatic breakthroughs around the world, including in this country. And of course, we've had many things change for the worse. We've had hunger go up, we've had war go up. There's been lots of change. But the biggest question is, in my view, why things changed. Some things changed because business as usual continued. Some things changed because people actually started to do things differently. Those ocean protection areas didn't get protected because the oceans thought it was a good idea. They got protected because policymakers decided to change their approach. In this country alone, we've gone from about 1% marine protected area to 15% marine protected area in 8 years. It's a massive change on a country with a lot of coastline that matters for the world. Poverty in this country has gone down roughly by half on the domestic poverty line since 2015. It's an extraordinary breakthrough after many, many years. But we're seeing so many things that are stuck. And I would argue, and I've reflected a lot, Margaret Biggs and I wrote some reports back in 2014 talking about the tectonic shift in the world and how we need to think differently about what the challenges are, the interconnected nature of the challenges, the economics and politics and how they intersect. And I would argue that the recognition we're having right now is not anything much more than, at its deepest form, a delayed onset of recognition around changes that were already underway. Let me single out, with all due respect to any of my colleagues who ever worked there, the World Bank. The World Bank yesterday put out their report, and they said extreme poverty is now less than it was before the pandemic. Last fall, they said, we are going to abandon, roughly speaking, our headline organizational goal of ending extreme poverty because the war in Ukraine and COVID have made it too hard. Homi and I recently went back and looked at the projections as of 2019 for extreme poverty in the world in 2030. They're almost exactly the same as they are today. We knew in 2019 that the world was not on track, but we didn't start doing anything differently. The World Bank set its own goal in 2013 to take on extreme poverty as its headline objective, one of two, but it didn't do enough things differently. So the core question is, what do we need to change? In that spirit, I've thought a lot about the proliferation of the concepts of the SDGs. You see it in company after company, and report after report. The logos are everywhere. People care about the SDGs because ultimately these goals aren't about, are we making enough progress? They're ultimately about 193 countries agreeing on right and wrong. There shouldn't be extreme poverty. There should be gender equality. We need to protect the planet. There's actually a deep ethical foundation that 193 countries have agreed on in terms of what good looks like. That is not the technocratic debate we're used to having about how to achieve these goals. That is a remarkable global premise on what good enough looks like. What we've seen is that the notion of doing things differently has been troublesome for governments under duress, even where there's success. However, we've seen many companies start to do things differently. We've seen many investors start to do things differently. Perhaps the greatest source of hope to me, we've seen many universities start to do things differently, not in this country and around the world. Major universities saying, we don't just need to think about how we're contributing to these goals by 2030, we need to make sure we're wired for the first time for what happens beyond 2030, for our students, for our researchers, and for the community we engage with. Ultimately, I think the SDGs offer three things: an analytical tool to help us make sense of the data. It's complicated. A collaborative tool to bring us all together, and a practical device to think about what needs to be done differently. We need to think differently about what the issues are. It's about well-being. It's about the planet. It's about our connections. We need to think differently about who matters. Why are our economic interests so-called hard issues, but other countries are so-called soft issues, if those countries have an increasing say in the world? We need to be thinking, I would argue, not just about the vehicles. We need to understand we're switching from combustion engines to electric vehicles, and we need some flying cars. We need some new vehicles, new institutions to help us bridge forward. But what we ultimately need, in my view, for this project of humanity to succeed is for people to feel they can take the goals into their own hands. If people feel like the SDGs and these goals are restricted to who goes to the United Nations headquarters, or who goes to the major summits, or who goes to their national capitals, these goals won't work. I am, above anyone, believe in the role of the governments. It's a huge piece. But these goals are about, as Khalil once put it, successful societies. And if people in their own walks of life, in their businesses, their schools, their communities of faith, their parent-teacher associations don't have a way to do things differently, to take these goals into their own hands, we will not do anything differently enough. So that, to me, is the challenge of our generation, is to find ways that people, whatever their stage, whatever their stature, whatever their walk of life, can take these goals into their own hands. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be here today, because this needs to be, in my view, the start of a new conversation on how we can all think about doing things differently. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, John, for those opening remarks. And to Chris, I think John and Chris have now set the table very nicely for a discussion. Our job now is to roll up our sleeves. You will be rewarded for pith and concision, concentration of insight. We're going to try to move from the conceptual to the concrete over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. You've already been elegantly introduced by John to Homi and Caren. Let me just say a word about Kate Higgins in the center, who is the president and CEO of Cooperation Canada, which is the umbrella organization of Canada's global development institutions, of which AKF Canada is a very proud member. But Kate has had a whole series of very important roles in executive positions in the development sector in Canada, but also as a researcher and policy analyst, and so brings all that insight to this conversation. Welcome, Kate. We will not rehearse all the ways in which the world has changed since 2015. Both Chris and John have talked about that. Let us simply stipulate that we are in a different world today than we were in 2015 when the SDGs were established and promulgated. Do the SDGs matter anymore, Homi?
I think they probably matter even more than they did in 2015. And, you know, I think even in 2015, we talked about sustainable development. All of these things, many people thought of as being things that were really nice to have. These were the things we wanted to have. But if we didn't have them all, it wouldn't be such a big deal. And development, international development, not national development, has always really been thought of that way. These were all good things. But really, if push comes to shove, a little bit later, a little bit longer, we could still make progress, and that would be good enough. I think what's happened is that's changed. It's no longer good enough just to say a little bit more, a little bit of progress, and that's going to be good enough. I think today there's a recognition that sustainable development has become an imperative. And it's an imperative for a number of reasons. I mean, if you were to just have a thought experiment, say you ask people, what's the greatest threat in the world today? You might get some people saying, well, Putin's war in Ukraine. Some people might say, you know, China's efforts to dominate the world economy. You might get some people saying it's climate change. So what's the common element in all of those three things? It's that the position of developing countries has diverged from the position of G7 countries. When the UN last year introduced a resolution to demand that Russia withdraw from Ukrainian territory, 40 countries around the world, with roughly half of the world's population, either abstained or voted against. When officials in Washington tried to push African countries to not to have Huawei technologies, they pushed back and said, no, actually for our digital communications efforts and the network backbone, this offers us the cheapest, most cost-effective way forward. And when on, you know, climate, you think that today, or certainly by 2030, developing countries outside of China will be responsible for half of the world's emissions, and they're saying we need to actually have this kind of improvement in the energy that we in our energy access in order to be able to sustain development at fairly meager levels, we have a problem. So developing countries are saying we need to do things differently, and the SDGs are the lingua franca about what that differently means to them. If we don't actually start to make much more rapid progress on the SDGs, we will continue to get this kind of divergence. So, you know, Chris in his speech said, look, the SDGs, they provide for medium-term planning. Absolutely, and we've got 7 more years in the second half in order to get somewhere. Everybody's doing medium-term plans. We have more medium-term plans than I've ever seen in the world. They're all good things, but there's been very little progress on many of those medium-term plans. We need coalitions. John mentioned one of the things the SDGs do is they don't just talk about this is what governments have to do. It's a whole of society kind of effort, and the biggest part of that is perhaps the private sector and private business. We have all kinds of companies now doing ESG reporting, SDG reporting, and then we also have a huge amount of backlash about greenwashing and other things. And what do we have from the regulators of the most advanced economies in the world? Very little. So we've got a hodgepodge of reporting and real difficulty in establishing whether these kinds of companies are actually getting together and doing things. And then finally, what the SDGs do is they give you a sense of scale and urgency. So, you know, imagine you're in a car and you're driving off a cliff and you start to brake, but you're braking a little bit too slowly and you go off the cliff. Does it really matter that you were braking? What's important is not going off the cliff. We are going off the cliff with climate change. There is an element of scale and urgency. There are tipping points in our world that are not being addressed. And what the SDGs do is they identify those tipping points, they have set goals and targets, and they essentially say, if we don't reach them, it will be at our peril. So I think for the first time, they've introduced a time frame and an urgency and a scale which has to drive what we think of as being good enough change. Otherwise, things will be improving, and then we go off the cliff.
Kate, Homi is saying to us that the SDGs are even more important, that we've gone from sustainable development being a nice to have to now being a global imperative, that the SDGs are a lingua franca. They are a bridge to bringing sectors together. They provide a impetus for urgency and scale. Is Homi too invested in these 17 goals?
No, I don't think so. Do the SDGs matter? Yes, absolutely. Does the world feel very different now in 2023 to how it felt in 2015? From my perspective, yes. And I think one of the things we need to try and wrap our head around for those of us that are trying to propagate and push and advocate for the SDGs is how do we make them feel relevant in this particular context? So I'm giving my personal perspective. In 2015, many of us had worked really hard for an ambitious sustainable development framework, and I think really key to that was that it was about universality. It was not just about what was happening over there, but it was what was happening here. And I think what John reminded us of in his opening remarks of the importance of sustainable development and the applicability of the SDGs to us here in Ottawa, in Canada, and around the world is really critical. I think where there is some discomfort with the SDG framework right now is the SDGs are kind of ordered. They give us goals, and then they give us targets, and it feels very systematic, and it feels very linear, and the world does not feel like that right now. We have misinformation. We have a war in Ukraine. We have chronic global insecurity. We have a crackdown on civic space that is petrifying. We have women's rights, queer rights under attack around the world. We have a very, very organized anti-progressive movement that is really pushing back against a lot of the progress. And we have climate change and the climate crisis that is absolutely petrifying. So that feels very unstructured. It feels very disorderly, and it's very scary. And so as I've been reflecting in this role that I have now and in the way that I'm deeply invested in the SDGs, what does that mean? I think it's not only around the importance of the SDGs, but the relevance of the SDGs. And how do we really ensure that that very compelling, well thought through framework is really talking to people where they're at, with the challenges that they're facing, with the issues that they're seeing. So I guess that would be my key reflection on where we are with the Sustainable Development Goals and how we need to ensure that they feel relevant so we're able to unlock some of the doing things differently and the change that we need to see to really drive forward progress.
Caren, are the SDGs orderly and analytical framework trying to colonize what is a messy and disordered world?
It's a great question. I want to say, first of all, I fully agree with both Homi and Kate. The world is very disorderly and messy, and unfortunately, bureaucrats have followed the SDGs in a rather technocratic and bureaucratic way. And I think this is one of the things we actually do need to do differently. We need to get beyond the linearities. We need to think across silos. If you remember back in 2015, the SDGs are holistic. They're all interconnected. And when you think about it, there's feedback effects across all of them, for good and for bad. But we're not thinking that way today. I was at the UN General Assembly, and I was in panels on climate change and in panels on pandemic preparedness. But nobody made the connection between the fact that climate change increases the probability of pandemics, faster transmission because of all kinds of other channels. And financing conversations are siloed. It's climate finance. It's the pandemic prevention fund. It's not how we get the synergies and the efficiencies out of all of these working together, and how we take that holistic lens again. And I think that's really, really important. And when I think about the issues that I've worked on for many years on gender equality, I'm a development economist, and I don't always talk about rights. But I think the SDGs are so relevant, given what Kate said, the backlash around the world to women's rights, human rights, economic rights, political rights, and the fact that in the face of populism and autocratic governments and the vitriol that comes from right-wing extremism, whether it's fundamentalism in any religion or fundamentalism in politics, people feel very pessimistic about what to do. And that's an area where we need to think differently and do differently. And I agree fully with John. We need collaboration. We need different types of partners to get us through this.
Okay, you've convinced me that the world has changed dramatically since 2015, when these SDGs were first established and negotiated, but that they remain relevant, maybe are even more relevant today. We've also heard that actually our progress on achieving them has been pretty poor. The title of the Brookings report is Ideas for Doing Things Differently. So I understand this to be the difference between predicting the flood and building the ark. So, Homi, let's talk a bit about now what kind of arcs we need to build, given what is clearly the case, that on current trajectories, these SDGs are simply a fantasy. Homi, what do we need to do? Let's start with the discussion that you have been having as part of the report around financing, especially in the multilateral development bank system. The numbers are eye-popping, billions to trillions. What do we need to do differently with respect to financing to have the resources available to underwrite the achievement of the goals in the time that we have left?
Well, first let me say that the numbers are not billions to trillions. The numbers are more like 0 to something. The rather extraordinary fact is that we have set up a huge apparatus of what we call the international financial architecture to try to transfer resources to developing countries, to enable them to, do some investments, do some spending to achieve the SDGs. If you think about what is likely to happen this year, interest rates have gone up, and most loans to developing countries are at floating interest rates, so the interest charges will go up. My guess is that if you took all of the MDBs together, the net transfer of resources in 2023 will be approximately 0. 0. They're taking out from countries as much in repayments and interest charges as they're able to disperse back into the system. You can't have that system and at the same time say, and look, there's real urgency for you to do all of these other things. Poverty reduction and climate change and adaptation and address hunger and gender issues and everything. And don't forget, we've got to protect the planet and do some biodiversity conservation, because all of the real hotspots for biodiversity now are in developing countries. Each of these costs something. And right now, we're not scaled to be able to do that much. But actually, the good news is that we have an architecture which has leverage, significant leverage, that for quite modest inputs can deliver really large outputs. The US administration just introduced a supplemental bill to Congress. Unfortunately, Congress isn't particularly functional right now, so we don't really know what's going to happen to that. But the numbers are interesting. For IBRD, for the World Bank, they asked for an authorization of about $500 million. And they said this $500 million is going to unlock $20+ billion of new lending. That's 40 to 1. So leverage is the name of the game today. All of our architecture, including most of official development assistance, aid, is unleveraged. The big new thing is how do we switch from unleveraged resources to leveraged resources and hopefully be able to get something done. There's one other thing, if I can take another few seconds. When you look at what's happening in the world today, one of the things that really stands out is there's not as much growth as there used to be, or that we thought that there was going to be. If we don't have growth, two things follow. One, you don't get domestic resources to be able to do lots of the things you hope to be able to do. That's a big problem. Second, some of the things like poverty reduction, which we've always basically relied on growth as the engine that delivered poverty reduction for us in the world, stalls. So if we're not going to have growth, we need a new way of thinking about poverty reduction. One of the things that John and I were writing about is that actually there are new ways and new tools and new things that can be done. We have focused on cash transfers. It's now technologically, it's a fairly simple thing to do. Everybody's got a mobile phone of some kind. In the poorest countries in the world, countries like Togo, had incredibly successful and efficient cash transfer programs that they introduced during COVID. Why can't we do this everywhere in the world? So we ran some numbers, and the answer is, actually, we probably could. It wouldn't be that expensive in the grand scheme of things, and then there would be a realistic chance of eradicating for all time extreme poverty defined as being people living under $2.15. Harry Truman was the first US president to say, we can eradicate poverty in our time. I think then he might have been a little enthusiastic in his statement. Today, I think if you set a time frame, maybe 7 years might be a bit, but 10 years, 15 years, definitely feasible. So I think it's a matter of how we think about these kinds of things. We have new technologies, we have new devices, we actually could do it. We need to find some real political willingness to actually say, yes, let's do some things, let's do things differently and really see what happens.
Thanks, Homi. So two areas where we could really push the envelope on financing. One is to be as imaginative and ambitious as we can be on the question of leverage. Essentially bet on the current MDB architecture as a tool for advancing in a very, very ambitious way the SDG agenda. And then this little example, maybe not so little, of taking a particular intervention which is of general purpose. It's kind of a general purpose development technology, and around cash transfers and resourcing it, in a sense, to reach everyone who needs it. So 2 arcs in the face of the floods that we're predicting. Caren, let me move to you. You have done a great deal over your career to help us think through the gendered effects of a whole series of economic interventions. You have identified especially areas of the care economy where women are most significantly exposed as a real opportunity for us to move. So talk to us a little bit about what kinds of things do you think would make a big difference in relation to the gender equality framework that's embedded in the SDGs when it comes to the question of the care economy?
I'd love to answer that question, but I have to say 2 things about what Homi said, if you'll give me the opportunity. The first thing I want to say is that I fully agree with Homi about cash transfers. They're incredibly important, but I think cash transfers need to be situated in a broader system of social protection that involves insurance mechanisms and other things. And I think that's really, really critical to think holistically. Now, when we think about cash transfers, and I agree with Homi, digitalization is absolutely key. But we have to remember that there's a gender digital divide. Women, poorest women, may not have the devices. They may not have the digital literacy. One of the things that the Novisi program in Togo did was deliberately put women at the center of the cash transfers. And if women didn't have the digital devices, they had to partner with the private sector to help deliver those devices, or they had to purchase those devices. And they had to work with women to be able to use those devices effectively. And I think there's enormous promise in digitalization. But if we don't tackle these other kinds of inequalities, that promise will not be effective.
In fact, it'll just reproduce.
It'll reproduce. The second thing I want to say is on growth. I'm writing a book with a friend right now, revisiting gender and development in the context of climate change. And economists are great with our growth models. We have a lot of discussion in the field about what kind of growth we can have. And I think that's a really serious conversation because the composition of growth has to change if we're going to live within our planetary boundaries and if we're not going to deplete people's human capabilities, because the type of growth is impoverishing the planet and people. And I think our serious conversation is how do we think about growth very differently. And I don't like buzzwords like inclusive growth, because I don't think we're really there yet in the way that we do it. The other thing I wanted to say about Homi, and then I'll come to care, is a social protection system needs to be financed. So we need to think about the revenue generation capabilities, not just of countries and governments, but we need to think about international finance, as Homi has done. On the domestic front, we need to think about taxation differently. And I think we need to put on the conversation, and I say this as a feminist economist, ways in which we can ensure that tax systems are progressive, that we're taxing capital in the way that we tax labor. We introduce wealth taxes in those countries where we can. We think about the range of taxes, of carbon taxes, from a revenue-raising point of view, as well as an efficiency and equity point of view. So we have to have these conversations together. It's not just social protection. It's about the financing side of it and how we're going to get there.
Caren, just pause for a second.
Care.
Let me just bring Kate in on pursuing the Homi's proposals and your reactions. Kate, please react to any part of it that you are moved to. But let me ask maybe a very pointed question. Homi's suggestion, which is that the current MDB architecture is worth investing in, maybe even really quite seriously in light of where we need to get and the possibilities of leverage. Aren't we just investing in a apparatus that got us into this mess in the first place?
What do you think, Khalil?
I have no views on this matter.
I mean, I think it really, it kind of goes back to my initial intervention, which is like we need relevant institutions. We need frameworks and institutions that are fit for purpose. And I think many of us would say that the MDP structure has not been fit for purpose. And so I think amazing people like Caren go on the inside and try to transform it and do things like this around cash transfers to, for example, ensure that women are at the center of those sorts of policy interventions. But I think, we do need to have a really good look at the MDB and the multilateral system and make sure that it's relevant for the chaotic world we find ourselves in.
Homi can't let my comments stand without response. Go ahead, Homi, then we're going to move to Caren on the...
Yeah, look, I want to be very clear that it's not just a matter of investing in the current system and letting them continue to operate in the same way as they're doing. It's a combination of investing in the current system and encouraging them to really change in quite dramatic ways. And so, that's why you now have these various reports. The World Bank has a so-called evolution roadmap, and the G20 has suggested a number of ways in which the MDBs can do better. There's a quite serious conversation about how they can change, but they do represent a very efficient form of financing that would be difficult to replace in the time frames that we have. So in some sense, there are lots of calls for a new financial architecture, for a new green bank or something like that. By the time a new green bank would be up, operational and running and able to deliver serious amounts of resources, it might well be too late, and it would certainly be twice as expensive as what it would be if we could make the current system work. So yes, it would be great if we had a better car, but fixing up the car we have and getting it to move, in my view, is probably the place to start placing our bets.
I think you've rescued your proposal from my mischievous question. Caren, talk to us a little bit about the proposals you are advancing now around the care economy.
I think care has entered the global agenda right now, even though we've been talking about care for feminist economists and others have been talking about care for more than 30 years. Look, we all need care. When we're born as infants, we need to be cared for. If we're ill, we need care. As we age, we need care. Everybody needs care. But it's largely women who bear the costs of care. Globally, around the world, women spend about 2.8 hours more on average per day doing caregiving tasks than do men. This is one of the areas, even during the pandemic, where there hasn't been much change. We had a lot of hope that because of lockdowns, men would enter the care economy, and that hasn't happened. And as we've, quote unquote, returned to, quote unquote, normal, and we go back to certain patterns, we don't make it easy for men to be able to care. It's incredibly important. And part of the issue, I think, is, we don't have the right infrastructure for care in the sense of the kinds of infrastructure that doesn't permit caring and services that don't permit caring. And services are both public and they're private and they're communal in different parts of the world. Countries don't have a good sense of what their services are that they offer. Canada's really unusual. Canada is actually fantastic because of the work that maybe you're not fantastic, but you're ahead of the rest of the world in terms of your new care policies. But let me give you some examples of this. I'm working actually with a colleague at the University of Toronto, where we have on a project. It's called Care Economies in Context, and what we're looking at is care is inherently local. You have your elder care homes, if you have an elder care home or you have a community daycare. That's in the advanced countries of the world. It doesn't exist in many developing countries. Child care is local, care of disability is local. But most cities don't have a sense of where those care services are, how they're organized, the time that people spend in them. They don't necessarily have programs to train unpaid caregivers to work in this sector. The wages in this sector are very, very low relative to other parts of the economy. So this sector really lacks investment and structure. But care is so central in light of mega trends, the poly-crisis you referred to. Think about climate change with increasing natural disasters. We have people who are going to need care. With increasing heat emergencies, which affect children and the elderly, we're going to need care. With war that has all kinds of dislocation, we're going to need care. And with the economic crises, with increasing impoverishment, we need care. So if we don't see investment in care as an investment, in the same way that we see investment in roads and bridges as an investment in our future, we're really going to go over the cliff that Homi talked about.
Caren, these are such important and interesting ideas around the care economy. Just say a word about, I mean, we talked about leverage here. Just say a word about why this issue and dealing with it is an important part of the broader SDG picture. What is its relationship? You talked about so compellingly about interconnectedness. Just help us draw the connections between really purposive attention and progress on the issues of the care economy and the role of women in this sector and what impact it would have more generally.
So there's a few ways, I think, to answer that question. There's some great work being done by friends in Europe and at the ILO on how investments in the care economy can have high fiscal multipliers in the sense of the kind of different kind of growth that can happen in terms of job creation for people, for men as well as for women. Investments in care, particularly in early childhood care, have intergenerational benefits for children who grow up to have capabilities that they might not otherwise have. So these are big picture arguments. And it's really hard when you get to the financing conversation to say we have to invest because people say we have all kinds of competing priorities, as opposed to saying there are synergies here and actually it's going to pay for itself in the long run. It's a transitional problem right now. We need to find the finance now to help us get the returns and the dividends later. And again, it's partly the siloing. So systems like education and healthcare and cash transfers just need to have this lens on where they can do investments a little bit differently here. And that's part of the synergistic, holistic way, I think, of thinking.
I would like to bring Kate in to talk a bit about situating this as part of a Canadian lens on the world. But I want to just alert you all that we're going to move to questions from the people who are in the room as well as those who are joining us online. So if there's something that has been said so far that you want to push on, this is the time to start formulating your penetrating and brief intervention. And if there's something that has not yet been said, that you're wondering why has it not yet been said, this again is a time to formulate with extraordinary concision your provocation to this panel. Kate, we've had a discussion about the relevance of the SDGs in a changing world. We've had 2 case studies of specific things that are available to us to do essentially now in order for us to course correct in a pretty significant way on the trajectories we're on. we have lots of different development frameworks going on in Canada right now. What does applying an SDG lens, either in general or in relation to these kinds of specific case studies, how should that play in relation to the Canadian global development program and posture right now? How does it fit in to the conversation we're having or should be having in Canada about this?
Well, that's a really great question. I think I have three points. I'm going to try for the pithy for you, Khalil. I mean, how does it fit in? I think we need to take a bit of a step back and think through how we're going to ensure it fits in now but is sustained and that there's consensus around this thing fitting in. Let me be a little clearer. When I responded about reform to the multilateral development bank system, I don't want that to be taken as me being anti-multilateralism or anti-internationalism. It's actually the very opposite. I deeply believe in the need for a multilateral global framework to tackle some of these very critical sustainable development issues that affect us here in Ottawa, in Canada, and around the world. So I think we do need to take a step back and think through how do we ensure we have real consensus around the need for us to invest in sustainable development. So we have this framework. And I think there's really interesting examples of how this framework is penetrating in Canada. I think universities are getting very curious about this SDG framework. I think municipalities are getting extremely curious about this framework. I attended FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, big conference earlier in this year, and there was a fantastic panel around how cities are taking the SDGs seriously and embedding it in their planning, how libraries are thinking about the SDGs and embedding it in their planning. And so then I've been reflecting a little bit on what is the Canadian international development community doing to embed this into our thinking and our engagement. And I have a reflection that is, I don't think controversial, but maybe explains a little bit where we're at. So the SDGs came about in 2015. At the same time, we had a change of government here and a very big push for us to think about what a feminist international development agenda would be. And I think many of us spent between 2015 and the launch of the Feminist International Assistance Policy in 2017 really engaging on that and actually not really engaging on the Sustainable Development Goals. Since then, there's been some really excellent examples of Canadian global leadership on sexual and reproductive health and rights, on the women's movement and the absolute vitality and importance of investing in women's and feminist organizations, in climate finance, in the care economy. But I think the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which I am deeply, deeply committed to, came about at a time when the Sustainable Development Goals were coming about. And so I think as we look to the future, as we try to make sense of this chaos, I think thinking about how the Feminist International Assistance Policy intersects with the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals is really, really important. And something that the international development community in Canada, I think, really needs to think hard about. I'd like to make one final point about how we really ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals and our commitment to the Sustainable Development Framework is really solidly embedded here in Canada, and that there's deep consensus around the importance of us investing in it domestically and in our global engagement. And I really think we need an independent broker around these conversations. And so I am deeply grateful to you, Khalil, and your colleagues for sharing this incredible space and for continuing to provide spaces for us to have these conversations. I'm deeply grateful to our colleagues from the Brookings Institution and the Centre for Sustainable Development for pushing us to have these conversations. But I really think we need to find ways where we bring together government, civil society, the academic community, the private sector, to really have conversations and embed deep consensus about the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Agenda. I frankly think that's a little bit of a gap that we have in the Canadian space right now. I think it's something that we need to invest in. And I think that will help us get this consensus that enables us to continue to invest domestically and globally in this really, really important agenda.
Well, that's a rallying call if I've ever heard one. So the floor is open. We'll take questions. If you have one, put up your hand and a mic will appear magically in front of you. I know some of your names, so a prolonged silence will be met by cold calling. Zahir is here, so please stand up, Zahir, and grab a mic and just introduce yourself. And you can pose your question. Jeff Black left the room as soon as I threatened cold calling.
Homi, you mentioned the fact that...
introduce yourself, Zahir.
My name is Zahir. I'm a retired former officer at Global Office Canada. Homi, you mentioned about the fact that we hit the brakes too late as we go over the cliff. I think the brakes are not working in the first place. That's the way it is, the reality. I was surprised about one thing that I thought was not discussed or not mentioned. But first of all, before I say that, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I'm glad I came. And thanks to AKF and to Brookings Institution for making really this possible. This has been very, very interesting, I must say. My question is that we never discuss debt, the rising debt levels. We talk about funding, we talk about transfer payments, we talk about all that stuff, and yet we never talk about the fact that there's a crippling debt load on many countries that was compounded by COVID. I think we need to factor that in. My question is to Homi. By the way, Homi, nice to see you in person. I've read some of your stuff on growth and poverty. Okay, good to see you. You mentioned about that poverty reduction and growth, the connection, of course, and I believe in that firmly. And you talked about cash transfers. Yes, cash transfers are good because they go directly to the household. Unlike projects, we think we will impact on the household. Cash transfers go directly to the households. But I'm assuming, or we're all assuming here, that cash transfers are, of course, because you have enough cash or you have surplus cash to do that. But isn't surplus cash itself dependent on economic growth? Can you explain the modus operandi of how when you say cash transfers? Thank you.
Thanks, Zahir. Let's take one more comment here or online before I turn it to the crowd. I'm about to call. Is there one online? Go ahead, Uju.
Yeah, so I can take another one that is coming online. The person says, excellent thought-provoking points made by all the speakers. Is there a need to develop new tools for assessing the economic impacts of the new ideas being discussed, such as care economics, whose benefits are both short and very long-term? And this is to help convince the policy and decision makers to increase financing in these areas.
Great, thank you. Homi, Zahir's asked a bunch of questions about cash transfers, so you should, happy for everyone to reflect on them. Homi, why don't you start? But I want to put that question even in a bigger frame. Let me suggest that we have made, the advances we have made under the SDGs in the last 7 years have been really advances mostly in human capital development, getting education and health to the last mile. We've got a big question which is simply unanswered, which is what is the future of the economy? We do not have an economic development vision for any part of the world that is equal to the actual economic needs of the SDGs. True or false?
False.
Well, that sums that up. Discuss.
So I think it is something to celebrate that we do have a real improvement in human capital in many places. The most important being that more children are actually living, first stage of human capital development, as John mentioned in his introductory talks. And yes, of course, economies are going to be in transition. We all know about how, digital technologies, AI, etc., everything is going to change. Fine. If those technologies end up, I think it's still open whether they will end up creating more jobs. They'll definitely change the nature of jobs. What they will do is inevitably they will increase productivity. So even if they are job destroying, they're only job destroying because their productivity increasing. Wealth will go up. Then it's up to each individual society to figure out, how do I now take some of that wealth and make sure that it's apportioned in a sensible and fair way so that everybody starts to benefit. And, we talked before, Caren raised the issue about domestic resources, taxation, efficient taxation. We do have a major problem, which is current tax systems pretty much across the world are fairly regressive. All of the progressive component of government comes from the expenditure side, not from the tax side. Once we go to these new technologies, we have to be much, much more conscious of what's going to happen on the tax side. But all of these new technologies will end up making us richer, and if we're richer and more productive, there'll be more opportunities, I think, to be able to do this. So I don't subscribe to the idea that in all of this uncertainty, it's a kind of a, oh my God, this is terrible. I subscribe to the idea that with all of this uncertainty, the one thing that we can probably count on is that productivity will ultimately go up, and then we have to be smart enough to be able to take advantage of that. If we're not, it can be quite destructive. We've seen examples of that already. So it's not a guarantee, but it does offer us an opportunity.
Do you want to just respond to the cash transfer issue specifically?
So one thing I want to be, so there are different types of cash transfers. So we have typically thought about cash transfers as being something that have to be sustained almost in perpetuity. And Caren talked about social protection, which does some of those things. And many of the cash transfers, think about pensions. You get a pension every single year. When we talk about cash transfers to eradicate extreme poverty, we're talking about one shot, one time cash transfers. It's not a cash transfer in perpetuity. I don't literally mean one shot, it could be, but it's a time-limited, time-bound that will enable low-income households to do the kinds of investments and to accumulate the kind of capital, whether it's a tin roof to replace a thatched roof, whether it's some cattle, whether it's a sewing machine, but to accumulate some kind of capital that then allows them to have an income level that is higher than the poverty level. And all of the experiments and the evidence that we have suggests that that is feasible. So it's a matter of finding that the transition financing, but then, like many of these things, the promise is that it then finances itself. I think the evidence comes from existing programs, but not necessarily programs that have been taken to scale. And so we still need to really see whether these things hold up when it is done pretty much at the level of the whole, at the level of a whole country or a province. Will I get a chance later to talk about debt?
Yeah, let's come back to debt. Kate, you wanted to get in.
Just a short comment around changing economic models and the need for evidence, and how evidence can drive kind of this change around what we see as being drivers of economic growth. And I do want to bring it back to the Canadian example, because I think investments in the care economy are a really good example of that, where Canada has seen a real reduction in child poverty, largely through the Canadian Child Benefit. Canada has made a big investment and a big bet on the importance of investing in childcare for really important social and economic outcomes. And then globally, Canada has made a significant, one of the most significant investments in the care economy through its international assistance financing. So I think it's a really interesting example where you see a country understanding how important, in this case, care is for sustainable development, and applying that logic, and that logic not only to its domestic policy framework, but also to its global and international development policy framework. So a really, I think, important and clear example of that. Super briefly, I think taking it even a step further back around the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and the universality of that. I mean, John and Margaret have encouraged us always to think of the SDGs and that framework as a North Star. And so I think this is a really good example around the care economy, where in the Canadian context, we have said investing in the care economy makes sense universally for us here at home, but also in the way that we're financing international assistance globally.
Yeah, Caren, I understand, thanks, Kate. Caren, I understand the intuition behind the question from our online participant to be about the limits of eloquence in making the case for the investments, maybe you're all suggesting, but specifically the ones that you're suggesting, that what we need to do is to crunch some numbers. So what's your reaction to that intuition, first of all, and then how do we crunch these numbers?
I think that's really important, but I also want to say one other thing. It's not just crunching the numbers, it's doing it in a way that reaches people's hearts, not just their minds, because I think what Kate is saying, the technocratic evidence won't go anywhere unless you also touch people where they are, and I think probably your care agenda helped touch some people. But I do think it's really important to invest in data collection, and just one little statistic that my former colleagues at the World Bank came up with is across all 231 SDG indicators, the 50 gender-related indicators are disproportionately underreported. And why is that? Because we just don't have the data. So it's not just sex disaggregated data, but it's data on things like time involved in caring. And there's been a lot of attempts around the world to develop things like time use surveys, which are really, really important. They're not always embedded in labor force surveys like they need to be, or into multi-purpose household surveys. I remember many years ago, a friend of mine named Ela Bhatt, who is the founder of the Self-Employed Women's Unions Association in India, said, what gets measured gets done. What's invisible stays invisible. So I think the importance of investing in this, and care is one of these things that has been relatively invisible. You might find, partly because of the lack of time use data, but also because care work, there's a bias about it because it's been seen as women's work and it's unpaid, so it's free and it doesn't enter the indicators of the market economy, even though it's the underbelly of the market economy. It's so essential to the functioning of the market economy. So systems of national accounts, labor force statistics. Frankly, we're never going to get women into the labor force unless we understand how they use their time in caring and how we can help reuse that to readjust labor market policy and investments in care. So, and there's lots of tools. I have to say the National Statistical Office here in Canada has been doing some great work on surveying unpaid caregivers. We have really great surveys around the world. That stuff really needs to be harnessed and used.
Thanks, Caren. We're going to bring this now gingerly to a conclusion. I want to give Homi a chance to respond to Zahir's provocation on the debt issue, and then I'm going to ask maybe each of you for a final reflection on the conversation we just had or didn't have. You can decide. Homi, are we on the brink of a debt crisis?
It's fairly clear that many countries are having to pay far higher interest rates for new financing. We are only on the brink of a debt crisis if the institutions that we have in the world to provide liquidity don't do it. But there's no particular reason why they shouldn't do it. So if we do have a systematic debt crisis, it will be a choice, not a not something that is inevitable. I think that the way to think about debt is that for almost all countries right now, they do have real difficulties and a fundamental choice. Do I try to get my public finances under control by limiting spending, which then has an effect on growth, but it also has an effect on not accumulating more debt? So I try that, or do I try to double down, put in more, spend more, get growth going? Which do I do? So if you look across the world, right after COVID, what did we see? Every advanced economy said, I'm going to double down and invest more. And everyone, debt levels have gone up, but the economies recovered, growth recovered, they did quite well. Every developing country didn't choose, but was forced into the other option, and it hasn't worked. So the question we have is, why is it that what's good in some good economics in some places is not considered to be good economics in those other places? And of course, you're going to have examples where there are countries where, you know, debt was accumulated, it was wasted, it was stolen. I mean, I don't want to, you know, minimize the instances where we have very serious issues, but I think for most countries that we're talking about, debt should be thought of as being, in some sense, the nitroglycerin that we need to inject into the system, because if we don't inject something into the system and make it go faster, we're not going to change things. So we have to change things, and this is going to be the way in which we can change things fast. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, but if we don't do it, I'm almost certain it won't work.
Caren, Kate, and then Homi in our last couple of minutes. What about a final reflection from you on the conversation we just had and what you take from it for yourselves and for the a very diverse group of people who are listening? Caren, you first.
Well, let me reflect on our conversation about care. I think the bright spot for me is that young men, I think, and young women do want to care. And I think if we have the energy of the young, who are not so steeped in old ways of doing things, they can come together to make a difference. The issue is they have to get our institutions to change, the rules to change, to enable caregiving to be, to help all people flourish. And that for me is optimistic.
Thank you, Karen. Kate.
Thank you, Khalil. I think my takeaway is I think I'm leaving from here very motivated to continue to push for bold Canadian engagement globally. And I think that that's something that we should never take for granted. And I think it's something that needs multi-partner, multi-sectoral, multi-people, multi-issue engagement. And I think really unlocking how we do that is absolutely critical. So I think my takeaway is maybe we need to think about doing things differently in the way that we broker those partnerships and those relationships and those conversations. So as I keep saying, we can ensure that there is consensus around the importance of Canada playing its role, its fair share role in the world, and being very engaged globally and internationally, because not only because it's the right thing to do, but it is the very, very smart thing for Canada to do.
Thanks, Kate. Homi.
So I think that, this just strong sense of uncertainty, of everything being different, etc., and how do I make sense of all of this? I mean, to me, that's exactly the kind of environment where you need some kind of a model, some kind of a simplification to say, this is what I really should care about and focus on. And to me, that's what the SDGs help provide us. And so that's one of the reasons why I think of the SDGs as being even more relevant today than they were in 2015. And I think the other thing that's emerged out of this conversation is that if we're actually going to be able to move forward on this agenda, it has to have really strong support internationally. You will only get international support if you're also doing things domestically, if you feel it emerges out of your own experiences. And I think that's one of the really interesting, novel things that the SDGs did introduce, this concept of universality, because it's the concept of universality that ultimately will underpin the ability to sustain international support, because there'll be an understanding that if it's good here, if it's working here, if we've got tangible experiences, then we can start to apply this elsewhere with a much better understanding of what we expect to achieve. And that will only be beneficial, I think, for the entire global community.
Thank you, Homi. One, the SDGs matter, a rare anchor of clarity in a bewildering and confusing moment of change in the world. Two, our progress to date has been woefully insufficient. Three, there are things that can be done. There is an affirmative, programmatic agenda of action that is available to redress the gaps and put us back on track. And four, it is up to us. Homi, Kate, Caren, thank you. We are in your debt for sharing so generously your insights, your convictions, and your enthusiasm with us and helping to shed a bit of light on the path ahead as we try to do things differently in the second half of this SDG journey. Thank you. We will take a brief 10-minute break for those of you in the room to refresh your coffees over there, for those of you online to refresh your coffees wherever you happen to be. And we will reconvene in about 10 minutes from now, and we will turn our attention, Homi's last comments were a great segue to the domestic part of this agenda. The SDGs are universal, not just about what's going on elsewhere, but what's happening here in Canada as well, and we will turn the spotlight to how the SDGs are contributing to development here at home. Thanks very much.
Hello? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Terrific. And do we have our virtual friend joining us? Maybe. We'll see if he pops up. From our virtual friend being the mayor of Kitchener.
I am here.
So he might well be. Oh, there he is, Barry. There you go. His Worship, Mayor Barry Verbanovich is here. We're delighted and honored that you're here. So we're now going to shift gears from this morning's session on the first part of the conversation to the second part of the conversation on, if the first is what's going on in the world, are the SDGs relevant for the world, to are they relevant for Canada and how? And I think there was maybe a biased consensus that they're very relevant for the world if we think differently about the chaos factor that is unsettling the world. And I really thought Kate made an important point on that. In many ways, I would argue we're in the middle of an international interregnum moment where we don't have the institutions to match the interests of people and the new distribution of power, and certainly not the new distribution of issues. Many people think that we are in an institutional challenge moment for how countries individually tackle the uncertainty of the world and the cross currents across issues. And I would say that that is as complicated as anything amidst a complex federation like Canada, where the division of powers constitutionally between the federal government, the provinces and territories, and the ultimately local communities as well, makes it, and I often have to remind my colleagues in other countries, you have to really know where the power lies on each issue in order to understand what set of constituencies you want to bring together, because it really is a decentralized federation with a strong centralizing force. So in that respect, we couldn't have a much better roster to talk that through. To my immediate left, we have Ellen Halls, who's the Director General for Intergovernmental Affairs, I think formally at ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada, which is, for any international friends who are watching online, this is kind of a mega ministry in the federal government that houses a huge amount of social policy for the country, but also is the home of the Sustainable Development Goal Unit that is charged with coordinating across the complexities of the federal government. And so that follows under Ellen's domain, and we're honored that you're here, and that the head of the SDG unit is here with you as well. We have Tony Pippa, who was mentioned earlier, is a senior fellow and senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development, where I happen to have the privilege to work with him. He directs many initiatives, including the SDG Leadership Cities Network. He has really taken on what I call a profound form of reverse technology transfer, having previously in one of his incarnations led strategy for the US Agency for International Development. He's now working on a very overlooked part of, in his view, and he's helped me learn federal policymaking in the United States, which is rural America, and how to revamp approaches to rural America and federal policymaking there, and has really provided a lot of national leadership on that. And crucially, he was the lead negotiator for the United States government in the final year of negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, and provides a deep sense of interconnection between the global challenges and the United States' role in the world, but also the societal challenges within the United States for how to think about those interconnections. We have Margaret Biggs, who is, full disclosure, a frequent collaborator of mine as well. She's a non-resident senior fellow with our Center for Sustainable Development. No stranger in this town, deputy minister, former, the final president of CEDA, but was also a deputy secretary to the cabinet for policy and planning, and had a distinguished career across the government. Was recently chair of the IDRC board, the International Development Research Center, is very involved in civil society and many universities across the country, and so provides that integrating perspective on domestic and global. So we're keen for your insights. Barry Verbenovich is the mayor of Kitchener since 2014, a longtime city councilor before that. And Barry is, I have to give full credit, Barry is well known on the international SDG scene as a leader of what localization looks like for the Sustainable Development Goals. No stranger to these global conversations, but also a real leader in the national and local conversations. So Barry, we're thrilled to have you here. Okay, enough from me. How are these goals relevant within Canada? I think that's our starting question. How and even why? Maybe Ellen, do you want to share with your thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. It's wonderful to be here. It's good to see some friendly faces around the room. Why is it relevant? It is always relevant. To me, this discussion is a non-starter. It is something that is so important to fundamentally everything we do and everything we try to achieve. For me, and I think for the SDG unit, living through COVID-19 proved that beyond a shadow of a doubt. We saw through literally every facet of every SDG, the interconnectedness of it and the importance of the framework to achieve sustainable development. We use this as our guiding principle to move forward. We believe in the indivisibility of the SDGs, and we try and present our evidence, our conversations, our reports around that to really draw out that feature. I'm hoping some or all of you have had a chance to look at our last VNR that was presented to the High-Level Political Forum in July. A very milestone report. I think as a government, we really took the opportunity to have a very honest conversation about some of the successes we've had, and there have been quite a few, but also with very open eyes and taking away rose-colored glasses to really have that conversation about where are we falling short and what can we do between now and 2030. I mean, time is running out. The global conversation certainly has identified that we are not in any position to achieve the SDGs and that we're falling behind. Not entirely good news, but certainly an impetus and I think a driving rationale why we need to focus on progress even more now in the relatively short time period that we have. From a domestic perspective, perhaps I could just share a couple lessons that we learned going through our VNR process. The importance of engaging whole of society. And John, thank you for that excellent introduction on sort of the setup of Canada. And yeah, we have challenges. The federal government does not hold all of the levers to achieve the SDGs. And in fact, many of the SDGs fall squarely within PT jurisdiction. So we do what we can, and we want to make sure that we're a leader in that space and that we use the convening power of the government to be a leader and to try and coerce, push, encourage others to come along with us. And through that, we've realized that we need to continue to reach out regularly, openly, honestly, all the time with stakeholders. And that includes everybody from PTs, municipalities, academia, not-for-profit, any segment of society that we can reach. I might just take this opportunity as a very short plug. We are about to stand up something called the External Advisory Committee for the SDGs. This is intended to be a whole of society committee. It will be representative of the regional diversity of Canada as well as the diversity of the people of Canada. We are looking for about 8 to 10 members to join this committee. It will act as an informal sounding board advice champion for the SDGs between now and 2030 to really drive progress home. If you haven't heard about it, our call for expression of interest is open till October 17th, and you can either reach out to myself or Mercedes, who's sitting in the front row here, or it is on our website as well. So we'd really like to encourage those of you who are leaders in your community, who want to have a voice at the table with the government, to please submit your expression of interest, and we would be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Maybe there are multiple important types of voices in the Canadian system of governance. We have distinguished public servants, and we have elected officials like Mary Verbenovich. Maybe, Barry, if you don't mind me calling you by your first name, how do you see this as a local political leader? Your website, I did look most recently, it's very clear that you describe yourself as only one vote on the city council, but you are, a leader who represents the city and has a really integrating voice for Kitchener and Waterloo. How do you see the relevance questions and why?
Well, thanks a million, John, and it really is a real pleasure to be here with everyone on the panel. I'm actually just going to mute not mute myself, but mute the audio because I'm getting feedback while I'm talking to myself. I will just say that certainly from a local government perspective, this is something I've been very passionate about, not only from a City of Kitchener point of view, but because of my involvement over the years, both with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, as well as our global network, which is United Cities and Local Governments, where we've been a strong voice since the SDGs were being originally created, as the Millennium Development Goals were winding down and the UN was starting to think about where the future went. We advocated very strongly about the need for local governments to be both a cross-cutting theme through all 17 goals, but also have a goal dedicated to us, and Goal 11, as you know, certainly does that. From a City of Kitchener point of view, we've really tried to do what we can so far in terms of localizing it, and I want to acknowledge our federal government for working with us on that. We certainly had access to some of the funding programs that were available early on through the federal department, and I have to say that the leadership of the folks on the panel, as well as the institute and that you and Tony are part of, has really been so important in part of that overall discussion. We've been able to engage the goals in our strategic plan, both our last one that wrapped up with the last term of council, and now our new one. We're putting measurements in place. But one of the really exciting things was that last year, together with Minister Gould, the former minister, as well as our Lieutenant Governor, Elizabeth Dowdeswell, we had the opportunity to launch our latest small business incubator called the SDG Idea Factory in downtown Kitchener, which is an opportunity to support small businesses that are working in the space of social enterprises, in the space of sustainability, as well as supporting businesses that are led by equity-seeking groups. And its launch has gone over very well. There's been a lot of interest in it. Certainly, as I had the opportunity to talk about it both at HLPF in New York in July, and then most recently when it was down now during UNGA week. Lots of people want to learn more about it. Some people want to learn how they can franchise it. We're not there yet, for the record. But the whole point being that I think there is more that Canadian cities can be doing in localizing and partnering with the federal government. And I would agree with the last comment. I think there's a real opportunity here to recognize, and it builds on that whole point about what we learned during the pandemic. It takes a village to deal with all these issues. And if we can bring all the partners together, the three orders of government, civil society, academia, and so on, we're fortunate to have U of W be home to SDSN Canada here locally, and really take things to the next level. And quite frankly, I think build on some of the leadership that we're trying to show as a country, and that Prime Minister Trudeau's trying to show as co-chair of the advocates group with Prime Minister Mia Mottley.
Thanks so much, Barry. Just on that last point, one of the things I find myself frequently pointing out, it always has to be remembered, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed in September 2015 when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, and they've been pursued since then under the government led by Prime Minister Trudeau. So I've spoken with senior Conservative members of Parliament who say, yeah, we've agreed on the goals. And then I think the big question is not whether the goals are right. Should we have better jobs? Should we have less poverty? And so forth. It's how should we achieve those goals? And that's what politics is for, is to debate the how. I don't know if that's an adequately exploited reference point for the discussions in this country, but I think it's a deep one. I'm curious, Tony, As someone who has thought as much as anyone about the formation of the SDGs, but then has also been, I think it's fair to say, fighting the good fight in terms of people thinking through how to interpret them domestically, how do you see their relevance, whether the words are used or not?
Thanks, John. Thanks, John, and thanks to both Aga Khan and Brookings for really being, convening this conversation. And it's great actually to follow the two speakers, and Barry, great to see you as always, and the work that you're all doing in Kitchener. I'm going to take us a little bit of a step back because I want to come back to this idea of universality. And we kind of throw that off quite quickly. And frankly, having been in the General Assembly while we were having this conversation, I have to admit that it was quite a big deal, actually, for high-income countries when the concept was put on the table that these goals would apply to every member state. It was not just going to be a continuation of the Millennium Development Goals and really focused on kind of the basic tenets of dignity and thinking of it as over there. And that concept of universality, I think, was a little bit jarring for us as high-income countries because it made us face our own reality, that we also had work to do within our own countries to achieve all of the things that were being reflected in the framework that we were negotiating around development and about sustainable development. Not just about development growing all the time, but actually being there for generations and generations and generations. And that requires a shift in mindset, but I would actually say our language still hasn't caught up with that shift in mindset. Even the language of development still implies a hierarchy, developed, developing. And that hierarchy even implies almost a superiority. Certain countries are at a better stage than other countries. Kate spoke a little bit this morning about how when you look at the goals on paper, they seem very orderly and linear. And that's the case when you get any two-dimensional pen on paper kind of thing. But frankly, putting the goals together was disorderly. It was a wide-ranging process with a lot of different stakeholders. And I would say are not perfect. I mean, the goals are not perfect. They are a political compromise. And they are a political compromise, though, because the countries of the world looked at each other, and we often talk about the interdependence amongst the goals, but they recognize the interdependence amongst themselves as countries. And that what happens in Canada, what happens in the US, is in part dependent upon what happens in other places of the world, and that those connections, our own futures, are bound up together. And so we were able to find a political compromise because we kept that at the core of that conversation. And that implied hierarchy needed to be undermined in some respects because we needed to be able to learn from each other and to be able to strategize together and to be able to honor that interdependence about who we would be together as a world. And so I think that that is even more relevant today, given all the things we talked about globally, what is happening this morning, than it was in 2015, when it seemed easier to latch on to that. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to come back to as a core element and a fundamental truth that the SDGs provide us. And I have a lot more to say about what that means to get us down to the local level and to the multiple stakeholders that Ellen also just talked about. But I think that that's a fundamental element that we have to continue to remind ourselves provides the relevance for what this is as a framework.
Very poignant. Thank you, Tony. Margaret, we've had so many conversations over the years where I still find it fun to listen to you as an ex-government person, because there's such a shift in perspective from when you're inside versus when you're outside. You have the benefit of having spent such a distinguished career inside, but now you've spent quite a few years working on these issues on the outside. How do you diagnose the relevance from where you sit now?
Well, thanks very much, John. And I just want to say I learned a tremendous amount from the morning panel and now and I agree with everything that's been said so far. Yeah, so I'll talk about the relevance issue, but the relevance for Canada issue, and then also, if you don't mind, just a little bit on, so how are we doing? Before we get into, I think, the next, like, what can we do maybe differently or the same or whatever. And I also have met Barry, hi Barry, who has been on this for, like, I don't know, 5 years ago, you were already at the cutting edge of these issues, and at the University of Waterloo and down in Kitchener-Waterloo. So I think if I can step back, I still think in Canada, to a certain extent, I think this will happen as new layers of leaders come on board, particularly political leaders, that the SDGs are still, seen as something that the UN told us to do. And John is extremely eloquent on debunking that these are goals that reflect what communities and groups and individuals citizens around the world said mattered in terms of societal success. But we still have to continue to make that case. And I think the Prime Minister himself at the United Nations a couple of times has been very eloquent on why the Sustainable Development Goals matter to Canada, and why we have to have humility in Canada about how we're doing. It goes to your question, Tony, about, we're actually leaving people behind. We actually have to think differently about how we grow our own economy, how we meet our own societal challenges. But I think there's still a tendency to see the SDGs as an obligation or something that we do over here on the side, as opposed to an opportunity. As a real opportunity to give Canada, I think Chris MacLennan talked about this morning, a roadmap. John and I have often talked about it as a North Star, but it's a way to think about where we want to go, and how these issues are very interrelated, but also how different communities and sectors and individuals can see the same destination point and why it matters, and then include their work together towards them. And I think it's also particularly important, as Tony said as well. It gives Canadians a way to look at how to work across borders, how to build a community, solve problems, learn lessons from other countries. And it's, as people and others who know better than I do, but it's a common language now. In Canada, we have official languages, but also business talks different than civil society talks different than academics. Sociologists don't talk the same language as economists. And this is a lingua franca across all those dimensions. And I think I would make the case that even though we think we're pretty good in Canada, we are particularly in need of a framework like this. We're very diverse, we're very diffuse, we're a very small population, relatively speaking, across a huge geographical mass. We're a federation which has many strengths. I'm talking to the Director General of Intergovernmental Relations. Many strengths. I did a lot of FedProv work myself. Many strengths, but it's difficult to build a national project when you have different orders of government, and then you have cities who often are at, very critical. So this gives, again, something that the federal government's not imposing, the UN's not imposing, a common framework that all jurisdictions can work with. I think it's also particularly important in Canada that the Sustainable Development Goals speak to the agenda Canada has around reconciliation with Indigenous communities, and that the Sustainable Development Goals are not just aligned and embed the climate change goals around Paris, but also the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And that's important, and I think First Nations communities and Indigenous communities and leaders in Canada have really seen the SDGs that way, as a neutral framework that they can use, but also one that really speaks to their values and the way in which they view the world in terms of because they actually are the architects of sustainable development. And finally, I'd just say for Canada, part of the reason I'm so excited about the SDGs in Canada is we don't have anything else like this because we're just not done it. In Europe, you often will find countries that have sustainable development strategies. They've been doing it for a number of decades. We haven't had that in Canada for a variety of reasons, partly because we're a federation. And so to a certain extent, even though we're doing lots of things, this gives us a framework in Canada that we've never had before. If I could just briefly talk about, so how are we doing, because I'd like to come back to that. I would sort of cut it in terms of how well are we doing in Canada in terms of advancing them, and how well are we doing in terms of achieving them. And in terms of advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, I just think a huge shout out to people like Ellen who've been working away on this. I think even the Prime Minister shows up in September at the United Nations. I think in many of the ways, and the Auditor General of Canada has given credit here to the Government of Canada, has laid the foundations, many of the foundations. Not looking at you, Tony, in the United States, we just did our second voluntary national review. There's a national strategy, there's a federal strategy, et cetera. Lots of the pieces are in place. There's Statistics Canada's led on a lot of the indicators work, so there's a lot of really good things there. And there's been a lot of action locally. People like Barrie, communities, cities, the community foundations of Canada, universities and colleges, I think Kate mentioned them. There have been constituencies that have really used the Sustainable Development Goals to have traction on their issues and to advance, and that's where I see the energy. But at the same time, and again, I'm not being critical of Ellen and her group here, it's taken a while to get there, as the Auditor General said, and maybe pick up the pace, Canada. But it is, and this morning's discussion was very pertinent for this, it's hard as a big national government or any government to kind of get your heads around. You do tend to put it on paper and have working groups and this and that for something that's so dynamic and synergistic and where it's hard to do. And it can grind you down. I've done a number of these projects. It can grind you down. And so I think there are options to think about how we might reboot some of that or re-energize some of that. The Government of Canada's national strategy really appropriately talks about whole of society, big check for that. Creating the enabling conditions, absolutely. So how are we doing on that? And the final point before I talk, I just want to say, John, then the big question is, okay, so how is Canada doing? Are we achieving the SDGs? Are we on track? And here I have to say, it's really hard to know. In fact, the only people, again, with all due reference, to the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada, it's hard to know how we're doing and to others. And really, John and Krista Rasmussen, who was a colleague of John's at the Brookings Center, did a study about 4 years ago now, trying to measure where we're on track, where we're off track, where we need to have, breakthrough change. It's really hard to do. And I think that would point me to some of the issues that if we don't, we can just get gobbled up by process and lose sight of essentially have more heat than light, lose sight of the forest or the trees. Like, how are we doing? Who are we leaving behind? How are we doing on those SDGs? And we do have some indicators, and we have some good little, you can look at the website, little barometers, how we're doing. We're off track on food security. We're on track for coastal protection, but we don't really pull that together for Canadians. And without that, we can't really fuel that dialogue that Barrie needs, that cities need, that ministries need, that civil society needs. So I'll leave it there. We're doing okay, but we're kind of not actually addressing the main issue, which is how do we ignite action on the SDGs to help us advance our societal goals.
Thank you, Margaret. I think this is a huge tension. There are a couple of huge tensions in here. One is this tension between something the UN came up with and kind of a mandate feeling of yet another thing, especially for people in government. And that doesn't land very well because people already feel pretty overloaded with, especially in the current context. There's another tension, which is how to follow through on issues getting teed up. So a lot of what we've heard today is, I would call, like the tee up. It's taken several years, but a lot of the tee up of the issues is helpful. But then how do you actually follow through on what it might imply? And that's a central challenge. We have seen, like marine protected areas, actually an extraordinary follow-through, which is not well understood in my view. Even on speaking to Government of Canada, I was looking at the poverty statistics online this morning. It does reference on the StatsCan landing page that it's cut roughly by half since 2015. We are following through on the goal to cut by half by 2030, just doesn't mention the Sustainable Development Goal to do so. And so, should it, is an interesting question. Do the terms Sustainable Development Goals help or hinder, even if there's a lingua franca that helps people come together? I'm curious, in navigating some of these tensions in the middle of the swirl, Ellen, how do you see the lessons to go from, if you accept it or feel free to reject it, this notion of like teeing up the issues versus like following through on them, and what are the lessons for the second half?
That's a great question. I guess I'll start off by saying I don't dispute anything Margaret said. I think those are fair comments. I think one of the most difficult things we have as a government is communicating and communicating effectively to Canadians on all of this. We're trying. We have made huge efforts on policy coherence, and I guess this speaks to not communicating well, but for instance, our colleagues at Environment Canada have based their entire federal sustainable development strategy on the 17 SDGs to bring some prominence to it and to link the targets. So there is efforts underway to do it, but as you said, it's not simple, and when we have to navigate through various levels of government, it becomes even more difficult. On measuring progress, absolutely essential. Do we have the right indicators for every SDG? Probably not. There's some very good reasons for it, that there aren't historical data for many of it, and to have a meaningful indicator, you'd want to compare it to previous years. And so there is a difficulty around establishing new indicators and making sure that you have the longitudinal data to support where you're trying to move forward. Not an excuse, but it is a complicating factor. From my perspective also, while we do have the Canadian Indicative Framework, which tries to take a domestic approach to measuring the SDGs from the Global Indicative Framework, what we're missing is whole of society contribution to that. The SDGs are not 100% within the federal government's domain. I would love to find a way to link the efforts of provinces, territories, municipalities, academia, not-for-profit, average citizens. How are they contributing to the goals? How can we measure that? Because certainly there's work being done out there that we're not quantifying, and we're not able to demonstrate the progress that is being made. But these are difficult issues to tackle. Given that we started with a premise that the 2030 agenda is voluntary, right? It wasn't through a formal convention at the UN. It's really through best efforts. And so trying to get folks on board sometimes isn't always easy. But again, I think, we need to get out there. We need to justify the reason. We need to tell our story. We need to bring folks to the table. And I think that's going to be a huge focus for us between now and 2030. And it's not just about whole of society. We're trying to do that within government as well, and not to sound too bureaucratic. We've tried to make a huge effort to push accountabilities down to the departments who are either predominantly or mostly responsible for SDGs. We want to get their views. We want to make sure that when they are contemplating new policies, new programs, new initiatives, that they're taking the time to reflect on what is the impact on one or many of the SDGs. Because undoubtedly, in my view, every penny the government spends, every policy they enact, every regulation they change will have an impact on one or more of the SDGs. And we need to tell that story, and we need to have a better understanding of what that is moving forward. So my job is feeling a little overwhelming right now. There's many, many challenges. But I love these conversations because it gives us a chance to reflect and to think and to hear views from others. So thank you very much.
There's an interesting question, thank you, Ellen, around, again, the SDGs as instruction versus the SDGs as a device. And I think so much of this comes down to how they can be used as a device to organize people in conversations in a different way. And I think that's part of what we need to do differently, actually, is figure out how the device can be more clever and creative to help people solve their problems in the spirit of opportunity that Margaret was describing. Barry, when you're talking with other mayors, what are the lessons of like, oh, here's what I've learned. If I were to start all over again, or given where we are now, here's something I'd recommend we do differently. moving forward as mayors, as a collective, or even for your own community?
So great question and great dialogue by the panel so far. It's interesting because I do think part of the problem, quite frankly, there's still not enough awareness about this. I mean, there are municipal leaders across the country who I can talk to, and they get it. They're engaged. They've incorporated into their strategic plans. They're doing innovative things in their cities. There are others that I talk to, and this is meant no disrespectful way to my colleagues. They just haven't been exposed to it, and so I look at them and I get this, this glaze, and then I'm sure, I see MacLennan chuckling, and I'm sure that's sort of a glaze that happened, at times in branches of the government as well. And so there is more work we need to do on this. To be frank, I think our academic sector has done a better job of dealing with this. We see it through the SDSN network in terms of how the universities have engaged in it, both in terms of some of their academic work, some of the work that they're doing, socially in the communities. I was at a school opening in Kitchener last year with a principal who actually had been exposed to the SDGs, and so we're at an opening out in the back of the school before all the kids come in on the first day of school. And what does he have up around the playground? The 17 SDGs. And he built the whole launch of the first day of school around the SDGs and how the school is going to contribute in their learnings, in their engagement and so on, to doing their little piece around this. And I can't tell you how excited I was by that, and in fact included him in our launch event of the factory. One of the things that we did in the lead up to the launch of the factory and since then is we've been actually doing monthly SDG talks on different SDGs, and we bring a panel of people together, invite the community out, and engage in a dialogue. And the whole point of them being is to raise awareness, and to bring people who are knowledge experts in the area to engage with the community and hopefully bring about more dialogue and action in terms of implementing things. And so one of the things, and I get it's always a challenge, right? How do we deal with FTP stuff? Where does the M fit in with FTP? And that becomes a little bit of a touchy dancing act sometimes. But maybe this is actually the kind of topic that can bring the three orders of government and civil society together, because it's beyond the Canadian sort of who does what, right? Like it's, if it's health, it's federal and province. If it's housing, it's a little bit of everybody, depending on the province or territory. Can we actually have everyone come together, maybe under, Brookings and AKDN or whatever, and invite the provincial, territorial, and national and municipal leadership, invite academia and so on, and actually have a bit of a summit in the not too distant future. And I'm probably rocking the boat a little bit by suggesting this, to actually come out with a bit of a collective game plan after a couple days of working together. And because this is under the UN umbrella, maybe it's sort of safe territory that nobody's going to feel like they're being a little pushed in spaces they don't want to be pushed in. Just a thought.
Well, Barry, I'll let you know you're the second person to recommend that today. Kate Higgins made a similar recommendation for kind of a national whole of society conference or kind of summit on exactly these issues, and I think it has a lot of merit.
Awesome, Kate. Let's talk afterwards.
I think, and I think part of it is the connection from the international to the domestic and how they all interrelate. Can I just also flag, though, I think one of the big places where this gets stuck is this FTP, for those who are watching online from outside federal territories, provinces, M as municipalities, complex acronym, or simple acronyms for complex issues. But this is often as kind of horizontal layers in discussion of like orders of government, but what so much of it is kind of verticals of different sectors connecting, not just business, civil society, and science, but like the environmental community, the social policy community, the finance community, and so forth. And that's where I see actually the device opportunity of the SDGs is often the most underexploited. And so I'm curious, Tony, you've been thinking about this quite a bit in terms of American society as opposed to the US government. How do you think we should be, any advice you have for Canadians, but how do we think about that societal component of this?
I think the things that we're touching on right now really get to the heart of doing things differently. We need different governance models. We don't necessarily think of the federal government meeting with the provincial, with the municipal governments in a way to say, how are we all pulling together toward the same North Star? At the local level, we don't often, municipal governments are better at this in bringing different stakeholders to the table, but it's odd to have a city develop its own strategy for its government, but see how to bring other stakeholders and how they contribute and actually are pulling together towards the same effort. How do you create a governance model in which those partnerships are authentic and there's some accountability? And the accountability, Ellen talked about the accountability, talked about, trying to measure the contributions of different segments of society. It's also measuring where there might be things happening that are undermining progress as well. And that's even more difficult conversation to have with multiple stakeholders. And then, John, to your point, we tend to do that around one issue or one system. Like, I used to work in philanthropy. We would convene a whole set of stakeholders around the educational system in that particular geographic area, from local government, State Board of Education, the private and public institutions. But how does education sit within all of the other things within the SDGs? And so how do you bring the different domains together to be able to break down those silos and look at the interconnections? That is a place where the SDGs, as our North Star, can force those conversations and create innovation around governance and accountability and partnerships and coordination that I think is very exciting. I want to come back to your earlier question, though, about, and Barry was talking about low levels of awareness around the SDGs. And I think, to your question about are they a device, or do we, and that worry about them coming in from the outside as something that was agreed up here and now being forced into many different parts of society, even more localized levels of society. First off, I think it's the local level that is able to grapple with the tangible aspects of all those interdependencies at a much more concrete and practical level than at a national ministry level, for example. Those things become much more concrete for Barry and his constituents, who are much closer to him, frankly, about all the different things that they're asking for in terms of quality of life and progress on the social and environmental objectives in Kitchener and that surrounding area, right? And so there's much more of a pragmatic, tangible, okay, if we do something on housing here, how is that going to affect inequality? How is that going to affect jobs? How is that going to be environmentally just? And how do we do it in a green way to take care of climate change? All those different things come to bear in a very concrete way at the local level. But what I've found in working with cities across the world and in the United States and also even in Canada, that it's not, okay, we're going to adopt the SDGs and do all those things. It's those communities saying, here's what we need for our community to be sustainable and to be equitable. Here are the 3 to 5 priorities that we have to work on. And by the way, this aligns quite nicely with the SDGs in these ways, and the SDGs give us the tools to measure if we can disaggregate the data. They give us the North Star on how far we can push. And back to the chaos and the chaotic things that people feel that are happening in the world these days that Kate spoke earlier about, it's actually coming at it from that perspective that gives people some ability to say, we're actually could be a part of contributing to global progress on this. This is a foothold into, we can solve our local problems, but we can see in solving our local problems how we fit in to something that's even larger than us. So the world actually becomes a little less chaotic. It becomes a little bit more manageable, and it becomes something I can contribute toward versus being passive and everything happening to me. And that is when I've seen the real power of this framework at the local level, provide elected leaders and also people in government and just local institutions like the Community Foundations of Canada, which is I think one of the reasons they've really embraced this. The universities that Barry's talked about, I think that's where they see the real power in helping take that on and providing a basis for progress and a positive agenda rather than the world is outside and it's affecting us in all these chaotic ways.
2 quick points. One is, it reminds me, Tony and I have been working with some others on Community Foundation Leaders International Group, where they've been framing the SDGs as, and Barry has of course been part of it, around innovation. Like SDGs is the frame for ultimately doing things differently, as the trigger for those who are kind of forward-thinking, forward-moving of how it could change. But a question I want to bring back, there's this brass tacks question that you've really helped me understand better, Tony, around, for a lot of cities and smaller communities, 17 is literally too much. And so if you're a small mayor's office, you just can't do it all. How do you think about that? And just very quickly, are there any quick lessons at the manageability issue?
It's the power of 3. It's the human, social, the economic, and the environmental. And looking at those 3 different lenses at once into the smaller number of priorities that you might see that you can work on gives you that sort of SDG sensitivity that I think is necessary. That doesn't leave any of those 17 goals kind of outside.
And that for me was a big insight, that even just getting those 3 conversations together at the city level is often a breakthrough, where every goal can still fit into the 3. We're going to open up to questions from the audience, physical and virtual, in a moment, but I want to give Margaret a chance to think about to share thoughts on what are these lessons for the second half, and what could Canada be doing differently?
Well, thanks, John. But I have to say, John and I did write a little essay as part of this series called Turbocharging Canada's Approach to the SDGs, and it really was about doing some things differently. Not to take away from, again, the good things that have been happening. And let me just, I really like all the things that Tony's saying and Ellen, but I'm going to pull it back a little bit more to the sort of the Canada, the national, federal government level. Because even within the government of Canada, in terms of a whole of government approach, which is really difficult to do, let alone a whole of society. I mean, the Auditor General report, there's a shout out in there for what Canada did around poverty reduction. There was a national strategy on poverty reduction. It includes the child benefit, includes a number of things. And it actually says in there, you set a target, you had indicators, disaggregated data, leadership, consultation, coordination. So you can't do it on everything, but on the big things that really matter, I think there are some ways that the Government of Canada itself can get its act together better in terms of really, again, it's not because of to use the SDG to achieve these societal goals. But if I could then pull back even further, I think, and I'm going to reference a report that I think others have looked at, it's a meta-analysis that came out in Nature magazine. Canada's not alone in this struggle. I'll just read to you this. It was a meta-analysis of, I don't know, 350 studies about the impact and the use of the SDGs. Came out last year, and it said the result was like some things out there, but it's largely discursive. It's a way of influencing the way actors understand, communicate. And I say, whoa, well that in itself is like a big get. I mean, that's good, but the SDGs are not really and truly driving change yet. So if you go back to my premise, which is the SDGs are a huge opportunity to drive change on the things that matter in terms of Khalil's successful societies, then what do we need to do differently? And I would just zero in on 3, actually. And the first one I think I'll start with is on data. And not because it's a be-all and end-all, but it's without the data is what's going to inform. It's around what you can galvanize action. It can inform decision making. It's not just an accountability tool. It's more of a it's a change tool. And there, I think in Canada, we've done a lot, and Stats Canada is one of the premier national statistical agencies in the world. But we've got data gaps, and I'll come back to that. We don't have a dashboard even with the data that we have that Barry can look at, that I can look at, that Kate can look at, that everybody in this room can look at to say, well, how are we doing? And to force that conversation about where we're off track and where we need to do more, or where we need to do things differently. We don't have that yet, and I think we could do that. And going back to the data gaps, if we're asking countries that have far less resources than Canada to try to do these things. In Canada, we have not invested in the data because you read the Auditor General's report, you read the response from the Government of Canada, and it's like, yeah, but we only have data that we have because we have data that departments want us to do and, you know, sort of the status quo. So we haven't invested in new data. So if we're not collecting data right now in Canada on some of these issues that really matter, well then that's a problem. But that conversation we're not having, and it's not Ellen's issue. It is a bigger Government of Canada issue. So I would start with data. There's a whole bunch of issues around there. Second thing is I would talk about how the Government of Canada can be more catalytic. It has its own shit to do, but how can it be more catalytic? And I think it has unique ability to connect and to convene. And again, as Barry said, the federal government has to walk a little carefully, but it can do these things and neutrally. So I would go on to say the Prime Minister is the UN Secretary General, one of the SDG advocates, co-chairs with Prime Minister Barbados, Mia Mottley. Well, who's our advocate in Canada? Like, bring it home, bring it to the home team, bring home, an SDG champion to Canada. Where are we convening? Yes, we should have, doesn't have to be one summit, but it could be multiple summits, and it doesn't have to be, with all the apparatus around, but where are we convening and creating those conversations where these leaders, where the Barrys of the world are in the room with everybody to have those conversations. And it can be a bit chaotic, but as Kate said, the world is chaotic, so let's have at it, because that's how we're going to actually have those kind of synergetic discussions. And I think, again, a little plug for Brookings, it has a format, it has a device with 17 rooms, or just take 5 of the rooms, I don't care, but just do it, and we have not done this in Canada, and it's 2023. The third thing is, would be, so I've got data, I've got catalysts, and I've got, I think, focus. Yes, we have to do 17, but even if communities can't do all 17, or they have to think about it in the 3 clumps, we could do the analysis and get it out there about where we're falling, like where are we falling behind? Drinking water, food security. Where is what Canada does, what we do in Canada has an outsized impact on the globe? Our boreal forests. We have the largest coastline in the world, so it matters what we're doing on coastal protection. So where do we actually have an outsized responsibility? Well, let's focus on those. And where is Canada not leading, not filling its responsibilities on issues that really matter globally, whether that's climate? And then I would also add, let's focus on some areas where Canada has a unique contribution to make. And there, I think, I would say there's issues around the role of Indigenous communities. I would say Indigenous-led, nature-based climate solutions. Bingo, the Montreal Protocol. Like, these are areas, so let's pull them out. Let's get people together. It sounds so simple, Margaret, but like, we haven't done it yet. I don't care which ones of those Canada chooses, but let's just do it. And I think in and of that, just changing the channel on how we go about this could have an absolutely catalytic effect on how we think about them.
Thank you.
Sorry, and we're in there.
Thank you. We need to turn to questions. I'm happy to keep going with the panel. Anything I want to check, do we have anything coming in online? If we do, we want to make sure we hear from them. I'm going to look around the audience if there's anything in the audience. But maybe we can go online and see first anything that's come up.
Yes, so online, the first question I have here is regarding the involvement of local communities. So specifically asking, can we reach out to local schools, especially middle and high school levels, to obtain relevant data and information needed to measure relevant SDGs at the local level, and then use this data to determine how we are doing on achieving the SDGs, and then also to educate the next generation about it?
Wow, what a great question. Maybe I want to ask Barry for thoughts on that, because, and maybe just to reference the Vital Voices and a lot of the community level data generation processes that have kind of merged with the SDG conversation. How do you see that local generation of data for young people, but overall being part of a solution?
Oh, I mean, certainly I think that the data piece is important, and you know, I'm one of a number of mayors who have been part of a program through Bloomberg, and our city has been as well, around the importance of data to help better guide and direct our cities going forward, particularly around, you know, as we reflect on some of these challenges. But I would agree with Margaret's last point that we do need, ideally, one agreed upon, you know, data portal where A, we know what we're measuring, and B, where we can find that data or input that data. I think that would be very helpful. Like right now, you know, we've got some work I know that University of Waterloo has done around data. We know that there's work that has been done by U of T and the Canadian, I'm going to forget the World Council on City Data, which is based out of U of T. We know that there's work that's been done by the community foundations around data, and all of these pieces are relevant. And, you know, I wonder if actually there may be a mechanism here where, you know, somehow we tie in StatsCan into this, and they actually become the overall keeper, the portal, you know, where everyone turns to as that trusted, reliable source going forward. You know, that may be a role, a convening role that the federal government can play on behalf of all three orders without upsetting the apple cart, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm reminded this point on the data is so crucial. It's often relegated to wonkery, but I think it's so crucial for many reasons, including the need for simple data to have media-informed conversations. So the reason the Human Development Index gets covered around the world every year is because it's very simple to interpret. It shows up around the world, and it's you know, a useful device for saying, how are we doing? In many cases, there's an official data set, and then there's a semi-official or unofficial data set that pushes things. Homi has been involved, Kharas, with pushing the World Bank to update its poverty data by doing a parallel process of saying, what can we actually say given the information at hand? And then the World Bank has finally started to do what we call nowcasting, after previously reporting with a multi-year lag on how the world is doing. I still find it striking that we don't have those conversations on how we're doing kind of in a healthy competition of who's got the right answer. You can go to StatsCan. It takes a bit of work to get there. They don't have the world's top Silicon Valley user interface designers. No utmost respect to them, but that's not what it's made for. It's kind of a public reporting mechanism. But there's so much that needs to be presented differently or argued differently in order to inform differently. But I want to turn to Tony for a second on this local bit, because the city of Los Angeles, for example, played a really active role in helping, with a lot of undergraduate students involved, I know, thinking about how cities collect data for the Sustainable Development Goals. Where does that stand? Did that provide any lessons? Because they were helping a lot of other cities too.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different lessons there. One is that they developed a partnership with 4 different universities, actually, to have students help them collect that data, and they created an open source platform that then actually some other cities have used and adopted. Having said that, it also becomes difficult for them as a city to continue to update that data in real time. And so the partnership was a huge step forward, and those partnerships were a huge step forward to get the baseline down, but then creating the ongoing investment to keep that data going, I think, continues to be somewhat of a challenge. Secondly, I think I would come back to the question even and about youth. Because I think, and Barry talked about levels of awareness. Generally speaking, at least in the United States, and my presumption would be it's probably somewhat similar in Canada, the group that has the highest knowledge and awareness of the SDGs is youth. And we work a lot with the state of Hawaii and 4 different counties and cities in Hawaii, and had a group of students actually come to the UN just a couple weeks ago at the UN General Assembly. And I think what's powerful is that youth not only are aware of and are, seeking to ensure that this agenda is taken seriously, but they're actually leading on this as well. One of our colleagues at the Center for Sustainable Development, Sarah Mendelson, who's a non-resident, is called Cohort 2030. And I think having youth involvement and youth actually being at the table for these conversations, local governments or between federal and provincial and municipal governments, even other stakeholders, changes the dynamics of the conversation immediately, because it is their future as well that these goals have a lot of relevance for. And they acknowledge that quite clearly. They force the conversation around that, and they also have ideas and leadership to put on the table, the innovation that you were talking about, and willingness to act on that interventions and that innovation that sometimes we're missing, or sometimes is much slower than we might like, not quite as catalytic as we might act. And so I think there's a germ in that question around youth that is really important to this agenda and really important to the relevance of this agenda.
Oh, please, thank you so much. And yeah, please introduce yourself.
Hi.
And love to hear.
My name is Joanna Sahas-Martin. I'm currently a fellow, or a fella, at Carleton University's Arthur Kruger College of Public Affairs. I'm actually teaching a course on SDGs and international assistance relations and kind of beyond 2030. I'm really hoping some of our students are listening online because this has been a fantastic opportunity to hear from all of these amazing speakers. Maybe this is too soon to ask, but the SDGs were agreed on in 2015, but preceded by a couple of years, as Homi Kharas will know, and many others in this room, of negotiations, of analysis, of figuring out like what makes sense and how do we do it. And I really love your points just now, Tony, about youth and hearing some of the comments I'm hearing from students and conversations with my own kids. What about timelines? Yes, we're at the halfway mark, but in a few years, we're going to have to start talking about what comes next. Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do we just keep going? And so to use a student metaphor, do we, are we soon going to need to pull an all-nighter, or do we ask for an extension? Thank you.
What a fun question. I would just say more people have started to ask me about, should we be thinking about after 2030? That's starting to bubble up, that question. My view is not quite yet. I think we have quite a bit. 7 years is quite a long time to do quite a bit, and I've personally been involved with lots of things that have changed dramatically within a 7-year time frame. So I think we have quite a bit, and we've seen just in Canada, several things have changed quite dramatically, even if many have not. I'm curious, how do each of you maybe open up this question, think about this deeper probing around young people and the timelines of bringing them into a process that's new and in a sense their process. Barry? Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks. And it's, I think that is an awesome question. And I'm actually going to say, I think we need to ask for both. We need to pull an all-nighter and we need to ask for an extension. And so on that front, I'll liken the all-nighter to your point, that, you know, we're not done yet. We can't give up. We're only at the midway point. There's a whole pile of work to do. And this is not unlike where we were with the Millennium Development Goals when the planning and the work started several years before 2015, that ultimately got us to you know, the SDGs being adopted. I'm really encouraged by the fact that work is actually going to be starting next year. I mean, the whole point of the Summit of the Future is to partially actually start that dialogue around what's going to come after the SDGs. And I know one of the things that we're really encouraged about as a local government constituency is the UN putting a framework in place to ensure that local governments and so on have a real input process and engagement in the Summit of the Future. And I know there will be some announcements on that in the very near future, maybe even this week yet, in terms of what that will look like. But then, you know, I think it really comes down to at the local level recognizing we need to crank up our own efforts, and that's why, you know, we're seeing community like ours and others. I mean, there's Fort Saskatchewan and others that are, you know, really engaging and bringing this into their strategic plans going forward. And I think, you know, by doing that and looking at maybe through a Canadian summit, we'll actually start some of that work that'll help inform what comes afterwards. But the youth piece, you know, I would argue is probably as important as quite frankly the local government piece was in the lead up to 2015. As we look at what will come after 2030, that youth piece is going to be incredibly important. And I don't want to forget about the other end of that spectrum, which is our older adults, because there's lots to be learned from their life experience. And I think sometimes we kind of forget about that. There's always a group that certainly is quite vocal, but you know, there's something to be said about that cross-generational interaction. And we don't do enough about, in my view, enough of that in our society, and it would be interesting to explore what that might look like.
I call it intergenerational teams as crucial. Why universities are actually very powerful focal points of that. I'm curious, any others? Maybe Tony, just on the having been involved with a past negotiation and so-called 8 million people involved, how do you think about the next one being better?
Well, again, even just leaving so the MDGs actually taught us that the second half is incredibly important. I mean, some of the most significant progress that we made during the MDGs came in the second half. And I mean, even up to the very end. You know, I was at the U.S. Agency for International Development where we were looking at under 5 mortality. And it was, you know, still with just 3 years to go that we did a whole call to action with UNICEF and the governments of India and Ethiopia. And we changed our whole strategy actually as a U.S. government, and really focused where the burden was the greatest. And, you know, within 2 years had 500,000 more children's lives saved because of that call to action. But as we go forward as well, and so I agree with Barry, we need both an all-nighter, but then we need to be thinking about what comes next. I think you saw from the MDG to the SDGs a real opening up of process, right? The MDGs were a small group of people and experts with a small group of countries sort of putting that on the table, got integrated into the Millennium Development Declaration. The SDGs, by contrast, 3 years worth of process. It was a General Assembly process, so all 193 member states in the actual intergovernmental negotiations, with also some openings for other stakeholders during that process. Because there was a recognition that it was going to go beyond just the resources of government alone and needed to include other parts of society. I would actually hope that as we go forward post-2030, that process opens up even more and is more, has a real seat at the table for local and municipal governments, for example, has an honest seat at the table, and maybe even thinks about how decision-making is influenced by other stakeholders, and literally has a strong youth component, because I think that is one of the things that would keep even the member states completely honest as they're moving forward into the negotiations.
Great. You guys, I'll give you a chance to, Alan and Margaret, if you want to come in on this too, but want to hear the next question. Yeah.
Thank you for your sharing. I'm Shi Yu, recently graduated master student at the University of Ottawa, and I would like to hear more about your perspective of climate change literacy, or today we could say SDG literacy. Yeah, I fully agree that the youth, the next generation, the children play a very crucial role in our, to addressing this pressing issues. And but thinking about every discipline and every professional, they have their own languages. And during the process of education, then how could we lower the cost of communication, lower the cost of collaboration? Yeah.
Oh, what a great question.
Thank you.
We're going to have to adjourn soon, so I'm going to ask, is there anything else online just to make sure? Yeah, maybe we'll bundle them and then come back to our panel. Yes.
So the other question I have online here speaks about any suggestions about Canadian best practices on engaging Indigenous communities in the SDGs, so in SDG activities locally, and then also an avenue to create greater awareness of international development within these communities, as this is seen as a huge gap that needs to be addressed.
Great. Maybe we can start with that one. Moderator's prerogative, maybe that's something we haven't talked enough about today, I would argue, and when the Prime Minister first went to the General Assembly, he framed it in the context of reconciliation. It was a point of critique of an initial Auditor General report that wasn't done. The Assembly of First Nations said initially, why weren't we more involved with the first pass at the strategy? So I think it's a huge question, and I'm sure there's views. So maybe Ellen, can you share just on that side, both the integration with the reconciliation agenda, just having had the annual day of recognizing that, but also, this is a deep historical injustice question that's confronting a very practical near-term policy agenda.
Great question. And I would say we have reflected a lot on this, and it was one of the drivers behind selecting our cross-cutting themes, international strategy. We actually focused one of those themes on reconciliation and making sure that we took significant effort to work with Indigenous peoples to make sure that their views are reflected in our strategy, that they're reflected in our annual reports, and that we continuously engage and have outreach with these communities. It was one of 3 cross-cutting themes that we adopted, and it has a huge importance, and I think you'll see both in our annual report and in our VNR the time and space that we have reserved to make sure there's a conversation around that. Further to that, we do have significant engagement agreements with the 3 largest national Indigenous organizations who we rely on and who we partner with extensively to help us advance the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda, both within the global community but also within their own communities. And we extend this practice to involving them in milestones. They were part of our official Canadian delegation to the high-level political forum for our VNR. And we, to the extent that we can, partner with them, and we are looking for representation again on our External Advisory Committee. So super important point, and I think in this space, there's really not, we need to do more and we need to continue to do more. There's not, it's not a place where we can pause, and I think that we've had some great experiences, but I know looking ahead to the next couple of years and in renewing some of our engagement agreements with the 3 big NIOs, we're really looking forward to having a better conversation about how we can support them in driving progress on the agenda in their communities.
Margaret, anything you want to add on the Indigenous issues, but also this, it's actually in a certain way related, the lingua franca, like how to make the conversations connect better, which is such an important piece of this. And I think goes back to Caren's earlier point on how we have more cross-disciplinary or cross-functional collaboration in government. In policy, I should say.
Well, I'd want to underscore the importance on Indigenous communities, and I do think Indigenous leaders have embraced the Sustainable Development Goals, and many of them have been were involved in the creation and the definition of. And I think it's. I don't have any examples of best practice. I think Alan probably spoke to that, so I don't have anything more to say there. But I do think, in and of itself, it's an important, and I think the Government of Canada has already given it the importance that it deserves in terms of how Canada approaches these issues. And I think in this case, it's one of those cases where we can learn a great deal from Indigenous leaders and communities about how to have sustainable development that's respectful of people and the planet and the land. But if this is my chance, I'll come back to a couple of the other points, John, if that's okay. Just, I just wanted to double-click, I learned that, double-click on Tony's point about the MDGs. Maybe back to your question about beyond 2030. I just think if you look at the MDGs, the experience in Canada as well, is that we didn't really start getting serious about the MDGs until the late 2000s. The high point was probably Muskoka and MDG 4 and 5 and whatever, but it just takes that long to build the systems, and we've heard build the literacy and the awareness to kick into action. So I think that the second half is really where the action has to happen. So I'm using Homi's metaphor. If we're about to go off the cliff, it's not time to start thinking about the next cliff, like we got to deal with the current cliff. And then using my PCO hat from my old cabinet days is, there's already agenda overflow in Canada, and even in people's personal lives. There's agenda overflow, and we do not need to take any attention away from what we need to do right now. So I would say, tactically or strategically, let's focus on the second half right now. And is this my last chance to talk, John?
I was going to give you another 30 seconds, but why don't you do that now?
Well, I just want to say, I just want to triple click on the youth point, but I also, in terms of going back to what we were talking about earlier about, okay, where can you actually start to get the conversations and the energy and whatever, I would go to cities and communities. I would just bring them together, and because things are going to happen, and I would like to come back to universities and colleges, which really, have embraced the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I mean, like, even using the Times Higher Education Impact results, ratings, which may be a bit hokey and people don't like them, but they are actually creating change. 4 in the top 10 Canadian universities, 10 in the top 50, because they're actually using them, and they're using them because it speaks to their students, and it speaks to what they need to do to break down silos between disciplines, and it speaks to where they need to, thematically and synergistically shape their research agendas. So that's powerful. And so having that conversation in Canada, in the US and whatever, I think is one of the places to go. That's all I'll say.
Thank you. Maybe I want to ask Tony, maybe any parting reflections and advice you'd have, either based on the conversation or anything that hasn't come up. Is there a takeaway you'd like to leave the audience with based on your kind of 360 perspective on so much of what we've talked about today?
Well, one thing is, I think, contained in the question around Indigenous populations, because I also heard about international development thrown in there, and one thing that I think has been a little bit implicit in this conversation today, but I want to make explicit, is that for high-income countries like Canada, like the United States, bringing the international and the domestic together is quite difficult. Our governments are not set up to do that very well, right? And there's a lot that Canada probably has to offer the world with the relationships that they're building with First Nations, and a lot to learn from the world as well. But actually doing that as a government and creating that dialogue internally as a government to then be able to use your public-facing and international leadership and also humility on that is quite difficult. And I think that is one thing we have to get better at for the second half of the SDGs. That will serve us much better, both progress in our own countries, but will serve us much better for the conversation to come, potentially post-2030. Secondly, on breaking down the language of different sectors, again, a little implicit that I'll make explicit. I personally have always been frustrated about the dichotomy between the climate conversations and sustainable development conversations. We disaggregate them. They're separate tracks in the UN, even in the multilateral system themselves. They become separate track that way because then in our national governments. And they even become separate tracks in the media and the way we think about these things. We have to become much better at being able to talk about those things. The way Caren was even talking about what the care economy means in terms of climate and vice versa. We have to create a language that captures both. And we have to do that also by bringing those two communities and those two tracks together in a much more integrated way. That's another thing we need to do differently for the second half.
I noticed yesterday, actually, that the Financial Times has, even on its digital version, one of the sections, economy, news, markets, is climate. And it's just structured a whole global conversation. So it's a question, what else do we need as another drop-down section, I think is a big query for us all. Ellen, any key takeaways you'd want to leave the room with or the audience?
Oh, there's so much that the conversation's been really riveting, and it's made me think about what we as well, I guess, first and foremost, as my department leading on the 2030 agenda needs to give some real serious thought to between now and 2030. Just reflecting on looking beyond 2030, it's certainly a conversation that we've had on the margins. My general view is, and I guess if I can continue with some of the academic terminology we're using, we kind of need to do that. We need to cram now between now and 2030 to get some of this done. And so I think, there is a bit of a disadvantage to thinking too far ahead. The other thing that strikes me, and it goes back to my earlier point around communications, like we have a cohort within Canada who understands the SDGs, who advocates for the SDGs, but it's not ubiquitous. And to think that in 2030 we could change that conversation completely and come up with a new terminology that we will then spend the next 7 years trying to communicate, and then spend the further 7 years trying to make real tangible progress, to me seems like a bit of a waste. I think one of the criticisms we have not heard from all of the engagement we have done is that the SDGs are not comprehensive. I've not heard anyone saying there's something missing. And so if we can agree to that, and if we think that this still makes sense, I would rather see a dialogue around, are the ambitions right? Do they need to change? Do they need to increase? Do they need to decrease? How are we going to better measure? What are we going to target? Rather than changing the conversation completely. I think just communications will continue to remain a challenge, and so if I had a plug, that would be my plug. Like, let's use the terminology that we've agreed to, let's make sure it makes sense, and then let's figure out what we want to do in the, well, I guess, immediate and foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. Barry, elected officials get final word as representative of all your constituents.
Uh-oh, that's kind of scary, but I'm just gonna build on Ellen's point and start off by saying the SDGs 2.0. Real simple, let's do it. What I will say to everyone there is, you know what? When the going gets tough, the tough get going. And let's all roll up our sleeves. Let's get this done. There's cities and communities are willing to work with our partners at the other orders of government, with civil society, with academia and other business partners to move forward with this. I think it's important to remember that, we often get caught up in these conversations around the divisions that exist in society. And I'd like to remind all of us that there is more that brings us together than divides us. In politics, sometimes people forget that. And I think it's so critical that we refocus on that, and that will help us achieve the goals going forward. And lastly, I really just want to say thank you. I mean, thank you, quite frankly, to both Margaret and Ellen, and both past and current civil servants who are there each and every day working on initiatives like this on behalf of Canadians. Having you part of these conversations is so critical. Secondly, thank you to both of you, John and Tony, and Brookings and the HBDN network for facilitating these kinds of dialogues, because that's the only way we're going to be able to take things to the next step. And lastly, I'll just say, I know in talking with colleagues, political colleagues in Ottawa, both in terms of the former minister's office and the current one, lots of great work happening since the HLPF and more recently since the UNGA, looking at what are those opportunities for deeper engagement with youth and civil society. What are the opportunities to really accelerate progress on localizing things, in working with cities and others, and build a plug for the SDG funding program that's there. I think it's always good for folks to access that, and ultimately, I think Canada has a great story to tell, and while there is work still to be done, I think we shouldn't shy away from telling that story and shouting from the hilltops about that work, and also how we're going to work together to achieve what's not done.
Thank you so much, Barry. I do want to just share a quick shout out to Louise Fox, our colleague who's here, who I was looking at when Tony was talking about. She's former chief economist at USAID and a non-resident with Brookings, and was involved, I think, with that era of the final push of the transition from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, and has been thinking a lot about these questions of how do we even measure vulnerability for the world as a deep challenge of what's actionable and what's persistent. But I would also just say I only discovered she was here, I think, through family ties. And I think it speaks to the depth of the nature of the ties that we're exploring here today. In my own family, they're across the border. But I think there's a set of political, conceptual, and just human family questions between the Canadian conversation, the US-based conversation, and the global conversation. So I'm quite thrilled that we've been able to have a version of that today in terms of what I actually think we need to do more of, to connect the national debate with the global debate, with things that people in other parts of the world can learn from and live through. But it does have to be both, it has to be learning in all directions. And so I want to thank that we have leaders from government, past and present, at all orders of government, and from civil society and elsewhere. And I just want to thank the Aga Khan team again for bringing us all together. But I also want to say, I was recently in a conversation with someone, said, all these goals, they're just too much, they're just too much. And I said, yeah, and we have actually systems for dealing with those. They're called government. Like, each of these goals is actually already someone's job. What we're not used to doing is putting it together. And the deeper point is that government can't do it alone. Each of these goals reflects what some scientist, some business person, some civil society advocate, some young person is already working on, but we don't yet have a way to bring them all together. And so I think ultimately, if we think of how hard it is to do that within this country, to bring everyone together, it's no wonder it's hard for the world to think about how to bring everyone together. So this essence of how to bring people together around the range of things they're already working on is ultimately, I think, one of the most central challenges we need of that localized action with the global systems of change. So thanks to Khalil and the Aga Khan team again for bringing us all together, and to Nuju and everyone else. But really just a pleasure on behalf of our Center for Sustainable Development to be with you. And let me hand it back to Khalil to bring us home. Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking our panel.
Well, thank you, John, and to you, Ellen, Tony, Margaret, your worship, for coming together with such a energetic and insightful conversation here. I'm left both, I think, struck by how much work there is yet to be done on this agenda, but also provoked by all the possibilities that are in front of us. I thank the very persistent audience, both online and here, for staying with us through this conversation. I want to thank, obviously, John MacArthur at the Brookings Center for Sustainable Development and the colleagues you brought with you, both for the compendium of essays that prompted our hosting of this, as well as the conversation we've been able to have today. There are many people from Brookings who've been involved in helping us put this off who are not on stage today or even in the city, and I want to thank them as well for the very happy collaboration that has brought us here. Global Affairs Canada has been a long-time partner of Aga Khan Foundation Canada's around the world, but in convening on issues of importance to the global development agenda. And I want to thank them for that collaboration, and of course Chris MacLennan, who was here this morning to kick off this conversation. It is a principle of work everywhere in the Aga Khan Development Network system that when we begin anything, the first question we ask is which volunteers will work with us. That is the case in the remote parts of mountain valleys, and it is the case here in Ottawa. I want to thank all the volunteers who help us put these events on. They're all kind of burrowed away working, I think, but I want to thank them, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them for all the work they do to allow us to bring people together in this space on an ongoing basis. I hope that we will continue this conversation in different ways, both immediately after we adjourn right now, but also in the coming days and weeks and months, and that maybe the ideas and provocations that were put on the table here might help guide and prioritize some of our efforts. There is a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of capability to do the work. So let us harness both impetus and capability and proceed to a better world, we hope, for all. Thank you for joining us. Uju the maestro will close us out. Uju.
We're not done yet. Okay. Thank you, Khalil. Just quickly, I'd like to give everyone a bit of information about some of the upcoming events that we have here at AKFC, so specifically also within this building. So on October 19th, we'll be having a joint event with the International Institution for Sustainable Development, where we'll be talking about implementing nature-based solutions that advances gender equality and social inclusion. Right after that event, also this month, we'll be having another session with Margaret and Joseph Wong for our book club series called Global Reads, and we'll be focusing on the book From Development to Democracy, The Transformation of Modern Asia. And then lastly, for now, I also want to keep people abreast of the event we have coming up earlier in November, which is in partnership with Canada's International Development Research Center and the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. We'll be having an Ottawa version of the launch of the Lancet Commission's report on peaceful societies through health equity and gender equality. I know I've just done a lot of word dumping on everyone, so for those of us that are in the room, to my far left, there's a table that has all of the information where you can also go and register, and then to all of our colleagues that are joining online, the links will be shared virtually for you to also register, share with your network, share with your colleagues, your friends, your family, as the topic sees fit. And then lastly today, I want to thank everyone once again for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have everyone be a part of today's conversation, both in person and online. And now I'd like to welcome everyone to please scan the QR code that is coming up on the screen, and to those online to please give us, take a few minutes to give us feedback about how today's event went. We really love to hear from you, and continue to use the feedback as we iterate the design and format of our future events. So once again, thank you so much to everyone, and we can give a warm round of applause again to all of our speakers.